speak. In the room, I now declare open this public hearing of the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which each of us are calling in from today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present with us here today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the subcommittee's webpage. I now invite members of the subcommittee to introduce themselves. Maybe if we start with people in the room.
Tony Zerbe, Federal Member for Maitland in South Australia.
Leon Rebello, the Federal Member for McPherson on the Gold Coast and the Deputy Chair of this committee.
Queenslanders?
Yeah, Shane Newman, Federal Member for Blair around Ipswich and Somerset region, South East Queensland.
Senator Dean Smith, Senator for Western Australia.
And David Batt, Member for Hinkler in Queensland.
That's everyone. I now welcome Dr. Isabella Watts and Associate Professor Anouk Ride to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
We'll go first.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the invitation to appear before you today. My name is Isabella Watts.
Oh. Sorry, yeah, if we just get the names, I've got a few more preliminaries before we get into the opening statements. Apologies.
I just say my name?
Yes.
Dr.
Yes.
Isabella Watts.
Thank you.
Thank you. And my name is Anouk Ride. I'm an associate professor at ANU.
Thank you. I can see also that Ms. Templeman has joined us on the line as well. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I would now invite each of you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed with questions. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and when responding to each question. Dr. Watts, would you like to begin?
Yes, Isabella Watts. Thank you, Chair and committee members, for the invitation to appear before you today. I appear before this committee as an independent expert, based on 20 years of experience at the intersection of international security and development across Asia-Pacific, Africa, and Latin America, including my time serving on the ground as a United Nations peacekeeper in fragile settings. My central message to this committee is clear. Conflict prevention is a matter of strict national interest. To prevent is a verb, and thus implies action, not a passive reaction. To prevent global conflict, secure our region, and protect our future, Australia must look beyond the historical responsibility to protect. We must courageously embrace our responsibility to prevent. Diplomacy and development are the tools. True resilience cannot be imported, nor can peace be enforced at the bear of a gun. The same is true for imposing democracy and economic prosperity. Our aid strategy requires a fundamental redesign. In a hyper-connected world and intensifying geostrategic competition, Australia's international development program must no longer be viewed as a discretionary form of white savior charity. Nor will focus solely on the defense military capacity serve as a deterrent against conflict. Strategic diplomacy and targeted development are our most cost-effective first line of defense. To effectively prevent conflict and build lasting stability, Australia's overreaching aid strategy requires a radical bottom-up redesign. It must shift from a paternalistic transactional top-down donor model to an enduring locally driven partnership framework that centers cultural understanding and local agency. To maintain a genuinely independent, pragmatic, and global relevant voice, Australia must expand its strategic horizon beyond the Pacific. I understand that while our primary influence is regional, the drivers of instability, that means states' fragility, climate disruption, and forced migration, they do not respect borders. We cannot afford a parochial foreign policy. If Australia does not actively shape global prevention doctrines, we will remain exposed to external shocks reaching our shores and be forced to react with an ad hoc band-aid. Thus, by adopting a doctrine of peace shaping, I repeat, peace shaping, Australia can help identify and address the root causes of conflict before they escalate into crisis, requiring costly military intervention. In my written submission, I outlined 6 strategic recommendations. I reiterate my strong willingness to support the committee's work across the nexus of peace, democracy, and development. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. Associate Professor Wright, would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I'd like to very much thank those who have initiated this inquiry. This question that the inquiry is dealing with is really one of the key questions of our time, which is how do we leverage our significant Australian aid investments for conflict prevention. I'm particularly concerned about conflict in Australia's closest neighbours. We know that Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands and Fiji are affected and have been affected recently by conflicts, violent conflicts. And we also know that globally we have more state-based conflicts than any time since World War II. So the problem that we're sort of thinking about today is one of great salience. Now, I would wager that the number of definitive evidence, provided about what Australia is doing for conflict prevention to this committee is quite small, beyond localised examples that we have within our region, for example. And there are good reasons why we don't have a lot of data and evidence to say what is Australia's aid program doing on conflict prevention. First of all, we don't have a across-the-board grievance mechanism that would deal with complaints about Australia's aid program. Second of all, we don't have great indicators on conflict specifically and on conflict prevention specifically. And thirdly, we have an ad hoc approach to conflict analysis building into our program design for our aid projects. So without such complete reports and data, we find ourselves in a situation where various things can be claimed, but not so much can be proven. Now, in academia, I'm at Australian National University. We also have very low investment in peace and conflict research in our Australian academic institutions. So I'm doing with colleagues at the University of Melbourne and senior colleagues, peace and conflict colleagues here in Australia and New Zealand, a study that indicates, at one point we had all of our major Australian universities as peace and conflict centres, which were doing really valuable research on what were the conflict issues in our Asia-Pacific region, how to respond, and working well with local actors. So from a height of 12, we're now down to maybe 2. There's a good centre at the University of New England, some of you will be familiar with, and there's also scattered programs at the University of Melbourne and elsewhere. So what we're not doing yet is really using our strategic position in Australia to gather knowledge, test ideas, and really understand conflict analysis and conflict prevention, particularly from our region. And I can see this in my daily existence. We have many applicants for PhD programs who have good ideas about how to deal with conflict issues in their countries, who can't find scholarships. We are constantly struggling for bits and pieces of funding in little portions of our academic existence, rather than having, a really good base to fund evidence and research. So how do we move forward from this? Well, I think we can look to our fellow OECD countries, such as Sweden and the UK, which have actually integrated conflict analysis into their aid program. And I can talk more detail about that later today if that's interesting. So we need to think more about how we do our peace and conflict analysis, perhaps some sort of impact statement in the way that we do with gender and climate, and then also looking at sharing and learning across our networks. So we have an Australian humanitarian partnership. They do some really good work on sharing and learning across experience, but to what extent is conflict part of that, for example? We can think about engaging with aid recipients on what they think are the peace and conflict issues that relate to aid programs, and particularly getting grievances early so that we can respond and make our aid program more responsive to aid recipient experiences. And finally, we can leverage, one of our great strengths that we've just seen with the Socceroos wins and other things, which is our diaspora communities, in Australia. They often have people who have experienced conflict, people who are experts in the conflicts of their home countries and their countries of origin. Using that diaspora network for conflict prevention is really an untapped, I think, potential for Australia in particular, as is learning from our experience of conflict ourselves with First Nations people and leveraging First Nations voices and experience to build links across our region. We also have a key strength which the government is doing a lot of work with, which is regionalism. So in the Pacific Islands Forum, there's a lot of valuable work on conflict prevention and early intervention in our Pacific Island countries. So I think in conclusion, there's much that we can do to strengthen the relationship between conflict prevention and aid, and I look forward to discussing this a little more this afternoon. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, and I'm very pleased to hear you talk about the model that the Socceroos give us, particularly in this overseas development space. I myself, with the former member for Moreton, was able to visit the Kakuma refugee camp where Socceroo Awema Bill has been running his Barefoot to Boots charity for more than a decade now. So something that really make you proud to be Australian. On more technical matters, both of your submissions discuss the importance of having an evidence base on conflict prevention, but also a common understanding of conflict prevention across the whole Australian government. Dr. Watts, in your written submission, you argue for, quote, whole of government coherence, aligning development, diplomacy and defence. And Dr. Ride, your submission added that, quote, researchers and officials are guilty of having assumptions or approaches to conflict that are based on personal beliefs or interests rather than evidence. Can you, this question is for both of you, can you share with the committee practical examples that you're aware of the implications of the absence of both this shared evidence base and shared conceptual understanding of conflict analysis in the Australian Development Program? What are the practical costs and implications of this absence of a shared understanding and the absence of a shared recognised evidence base?
Go first.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and it's a very good one. So as I sort of mentioned in the written submission, I spent a long time in Solomon Islands and have some close links there. And because I'm Australian, an Australian citizen, but also known to many people in Solomons, I sort of became the informal complaints department for Australian aid. And one of the key complaints that I got was that aid spends inevitably interact with the local power systems. So, for example, if you're building a road in a remote rural community, where are you going to get the gravel from? Is that going to benefit the local member of parliament or the local chief? Is that going to sort of change the power dynamics? Another example was a program, I don't think it was an Australian funded program, but it was a program to provide boats after a major disaster because that was their key mode of transport. But the distribution of those boats was led through a parliamentarian that had a highly controversial and conflict-ridden background. So how we deliver aid is very much linked to local power structures that can either create more inclusive power structures or it can create sometimes grievances or the feeling that, for example, Australian aid is supporting particular sides of politics or militants, for example, in the post-conflict stage of the Solomon Islands tension. So we need to think more carefully, even with projects that may not seem conflict related, like road building, what could be some potential conflicts and grievances, and how do we, deal with that early? How do we get local communities on board early in a way that they're comfortable with decisions that have been made that could potentially affect the power structures in their community? I think there are multiple examples of what you were talking about, but just to give you an example, we need to think about how aid is done and how conflict prevention can be built into it. So Australia has what I would categorise as a risk-based focus. During our development of aid project designs, we do look at risk, but it's very different to look at risk, which is, how will the conflict affect us, to look at conflict prevention, which is how can the project affect the conflict conditions and slowly make things better over time. So this is a shift of thinking that would be needed to really take aboard the conflict prevention agenda to Australia's aid program.
I would like to compliment, if I'm allowed, Dr. Isabella Watts. Before answering, I would like to really thank you for having the two of us together in this panel, in this session today. We didn't know each other, but since we prepared for this presentation, we really realized how much in common we have. So that means that you, the committee, actually read our proposal and understand how much in common we have, although we are presenting different topics, but we do align. So I would like to complement what Associate Professor Anouk Wright just mentioned in order to answer the question on the distinction. I would like to make the distinction between the 3 Ds. 3 Ds for defense, development, and diplomacy. So in these 3 Ds, at this moment, they work separately. I read the statements of the previous session, and I understand that some federal institutions came here and said that their work understand conflict prevention as implicit. I disagree in my expert capacity that is the shift that we require. It must be explicit. And here would like to bring you an example that is metaphorical and you can replicate in any area that you might consider. So let's imagine that today and now, defense believes that as a matter of national security and as a matter of regional stability, it's important to build a road or a port overseas. Defense engineers would go and analyze and explain and put a plan, procurement, everything that is necessary from a defense perspective. Let's imagine in that same region that we are building a port, a road, something that is important from a national security perspective. Somewhere there, nearby, there is an aid development project that is sidelined. It happens to be nearby. In between, you have members of our diplomacy that will go there and sign an MOU that says that this is very important that we are building this road or this port. Now, all this might have a good intention and might understand conflict prevention as implicit. The problem is good intention is not good enough. What the result is, we will be creating a conflict. Why? Because it will create grievances between clans, between elites that would like in that area to secure the funds. We'll have grievances in research competition for profit companies that at this moment in our system gain the development aid. So all that is creating conflict instead of preventing. So what is the solution, you would ask? The solution of redesigning is that the 3 Ds, I repeat, defense, diplomacy, and development should act together before each cent, each dollar is spent in any procurement. What should happen is a joint fragility assessment where the 3Ds will deploy to the area under defense outlook, under diplomacy outlook, under development outlook, and assess. They'll probably realize that, actually, where we are building a road or a port, we have a problem of ownership of the land. You might conclude that. In this assessment, which is joint, you would be able to realize and then prevent a conflict. For example, but not only building a road or a port, but also building a community water system. In that way, when the road or the port is built, the community perceives that as good intention and not as an evasion or occupation. It will perceive the community water system that came with the project of the road or the port as something beneficial. And all that can be overseen, to finish the example, can be oversaw by faith community, by woman community center, that can be the watchdogs, sorry, in English. That way, that is the difference between reacting to a crisis and structurally preventing one.
Thank you. I might hand to Mr. Rebello, who has a question in the room, and then Ms. Templeman.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you both for being here. I think the evidence you provided so far is really fascinating because it's very different to what we've heard. The inquiry has been mainly focused on how we can use our foreign aid to better prevent conflict, and you've added an additional element, which is the chance that our foreign aid is at times creating conflict itself. So I think that is something that's a very useful dimension and perspective that we can consider as a committee. I just wanted to run past you. So it sounds like from both of your submissions that in terms of our approach, both from a planning perspective in terms of how we plan where Australian aid is going, but also in terms of the execution, and then also in terms of how we measure it. And I think Professor Ride, you spoke about the indicators or the lack of indicators that we have. It seems like we have a bit of a scattergun approach at all three of those steps. Is that something you'd agree with?
Yes, absolutely. And I was just thinking, when my colleague Isabella was talking, I'd encourage the committee to look at the UK system because they have this joint analysis on conflict and stability, and it's sort of at the beginning of their processes for programs and so forth. But they've been running for about 10 years, so their learning from that is that basically that joint program helps different parts of the government to actually be on the same page. What are the conflict issues that we need to be aware of, and how should we be responding in a practical sense? So something like that, which would actually bring together the different departments and understand together the conflict. Because what you find, working across different government agencies is everyone has their own priorities, right? Like AEC is about elections, and DFAT's about foreign policy and so forth. So sometimes the different priorities can get in the way of seeing what the conflict issues are and responding appropriately. So that joint work, like Isabella was mentioning, is really important in terms of a response. And then I don't think we need to look too far away too. We have good indicators now on gender outcomes from the aid program, on climate outcomes from the aid program. So we can do that for conflict as well. Perhaps first prioritising the countries where we know are more vulnerable to violent conflicts. Yes.
And so just, I think that leads nicely to my main question, which is, as academics, as people who are constantly engaged in research and discussions on these subjects, do you feel that there is a disconnect right now between, firstly, yourselves and policymakers, such as including departments, but also, in an environment where we have limited funding at the moment, do you can you think of any practical ways that we can bring those two sides together so that, for example, the information that or the research that you come up with is directly relevant to funding decisions, but also vice versa, so that funding decisions are made based on the research that you provide?
Can I?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. This is music to my ears. This is something that I've been at least for the last 10 years preaching and doing advocacy and expressing how there is a big gap, and there's no other way to express this, between what we call the real world, and I'm one of them. I'm a former UN peacekeeper. I have 20 years of experience. I had a career with the United Nations. I managed 12 million funds in portfolio for development in East Timor. When I joined the academia, I joined because I truly believe that experience and theory and professional field experience go hand in hand. No one is better than any other, but it goes hand in hand. Joining the academia, on the other side of the table, sitting in another chair, I realized that on a personal capacity, I was a rare example, the only one in the whole school, the whole faculty of great professionals, but I was the only one with field experience, preaching and education to a new generation. When I worked for the Australian Federal Police, again, I was the only one in the whole international command who has actually been deployed and fluent in 4 other languages. That is not about me. That should be the norm. So indeed, I do believe that we need to have more bridges. I believe that I'm a bridge, but we need more bridges because those two sectors, they don't talk to each other, and therefore it is a loss of opportunity and knowledge. It's a loss of strategic design of having two great minds that can think strategically, that know the whys and hows, and others that are on the practical chain of command that can actually sign and execute. So I truly believe that we need mechanisms to make this bridge real and sustainable. Invite the academics and the experts to the table together with the policy makers to make it happen. That is a conflict prevention in itself.
Thank you, Chair.
I might just add on, if I can, to that. There's just, I agree with what Isabel is saying, and I think so I have some students and staff with me from ANU today, and we have particularly people who have in-country expertise in conflict, as well as like an in-depth knowledge of the place where the conflict is happening. I think that's the golden, that's what you need, yeah, for any sensible programming or any sensible decisions. And now, look, DFAT does have this new conflict prevention unit, but I would encourage that unit to be reaching out to us more often so that we can get that kind of expertise into DFAT when they need it. And I think not just us academics, but also the diaspora communities, like I mentioned before. I don't think we need to think about, we need to spend a lot of money. I think we need to be more effective with what we have. And we can do that by better understanding the conflicts that we're sort of engaging with and what our role in those situations are. So yeah, and I think finally, bringing recipients into the picture and more knowledge that comes actually from aid recipients into how we plan and respond to things when they happen can really help make aid more effective and also more conflict responsive.
I will just add a final point that is very easy. It doesn't need extra imagination to actually bring and to bridge this. So in order to have transparency and accountability, instead of reaching to a university or this institute, it's simple to create a roster. Who are the talent roster that are expert in where? Expert in Papua New Guinea, expert in East Timor, expert in Latin America, expert in localized conflict, expert in different kinds of conflict. To create a roster is not costly.
And that's also why your joint government initiatives like the sort of jacks that they have in the UK is good, because once you have those joint initiatives, we can feed to a part of that joint initiative, and we know it goes to that whole suite of government that's involved. Yeah.
Thank you. Ms Templeman.
And I might just say to Senator Smith, I think we're picking up some noise possibly from you not being on mute.
Okay. Thanks very much, Susan. Thank you. Yep.
Your face keeps flashing on my screen. I know you're not speaking. Thank you both for your insights. Now, you've given us some thoughts about the mechanisms you might use, but what I'd really love, if it's possible for either or both, to talk through what does best practice look like from a conflict prevention perspective of all the development working with diplomacy and defence. What is the best practice model from that assessment stage through to the delivery stage and then the evaluation stage? If you could just step us through what that ideally looks like and who's involved and who does what where.
I would like to start. Dr. Isabella Watts. I'll go back to the example that I already gave of the 3Ds, development, defense, and diplomacy working together. And before any dollar is ever spent, we do a joint assessment where we can identify and establish a plan to prevent at the moment. So, for example, if we realize that we have a problem of ownership, then you have to decide, do we build or we find what is the ownership and we keep going? There is already a conflict to be solved right there, but it's minimal. At least you're not creating a civil unrest at the end. We have to remember that. So going further to your question, how ideal looks like. After this, localization, it is not a buzzword. Localization cannot be at the table when there is no money at the table. So it seems to be a very buzzword that when there is now that we face aid cuts everywhere, there is a shift to localization. No, localization must be explicit, not implicit again. So ideally, I will now give an example of East Timor, which is a reality that is close to you and is very close to my heart. So, and I'm sure that we can multiply to Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and etc. So, understanding, first of all, how is the connective tissue of society. In the case of East Timor, and what we do wrong, Australian aid, is to be just in Dili, capital city. And again, you can multiply to any other reality. So we have to localize because conflict happens in the suko, which is the village. Happens far from the capital city, where the embassies and elites are fighting for the resources. So localization, it's conflict prevention in itself. And how do we bring all on board? This is called participatory democracy in terms of theory. I will reframe this on a more practical way. It's about when we design a project, and again, with defense, with diplomacy, and with the development, to, in the case of East Timor, go to the faith organization. The Catholic Church is extremely powerful. And why it's powerful? Because it's perceived as the most respectful institution for mediation and facilitation. So you have credibility there. Second, youth. In a society where majority of the population is under 18, unemployment is an issue. So you better include the youth voice. Third, of course, you have the gender and woman organization that could be the watching dogs that would certify and again monitor how the money is spent. Because once again, they are the voice of society. This is a way where you can listen. Listen comes first in development, which is a mechanism of do no harm. If we listen what they need, we will listen and explicitly identify what can be the conflict that we might be mitigating, avoiding, and therefore preventing. I'll finish here.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I have to say is sort of similar in that it starts with a good analysis. What are the structures of power? What are the tensions in those structures? For example, the youth population. People will say to me, countries with high youth populations have a higher risk of conflict. Actually, it's actually around whether the youth have a chance to participate in the economy, to participate in their politics. This is actually the key factor. It's about power. So the structures of power, also the psychology of different groups. Our beliefs and behaviours as Australians might be very different from beliefs and behaviours, in other contexts. And we need to understand and have an openness to that. And then finally, like social norms. So one of the examples I can use of this, for example, is I did a book on community resilience in natural disasters, and we had a chapter from Pakistan. And we looked at a big disaster that happened in Pakistan and how community groups responded before the military came in, before, government agencies came in. And we found actually that small community-based groups like the Boy Scouts actually did some amazing stuff, actually treating wounds, because they'd learnt it as part of their badge programs, treating wounds of their fellow students prior to anyone getting involved. So when we think about these conflict analyses too, we need to look for what are the sort of forms of resilience in that local place and how can we work with those during a conflict. I think too we need to sort of realise that conflict prevention and conflict response are very, very linked, right? So those who are, generally speaking, in the Pacific, for example, we have chiefs, we have churches, we have women's groups, they're all involved in conflict prevention and conflict response. And so in Solomon Islands, I often say the first responders are actually the women and the chiefs in most major incidences of violence. So when we think about conflict prevention, we also need to think about how are we building their capacity for the conflict response and their ability to move, when they need to respond to a murder or to respond to another major incidence of violence. So it starts with a good analysis, but the good analysis of the conflict has to be accompanied by learning along the way, for example, from your recipients, from your local peace builders, from your local NGOs, so that, when things come up, you can respond based on, what is really going to work in that local context. And localisation, as Isabella mentioned, is a huge part of that. To respond. But yeah, I think again, there's Sweden, the UK, they've illustrated how they can do that at different levels of their rolling out their aid and diplomacy programs. So there's lots that we can think about there in improving.
I would like to complement on the how do we break the power structure with a clear example. Go back to how we build a port or a road. So once we do the assessment, all together with the 3D team, excellent, with the idea, with the focus of true localized mechanism, means do no harm. So if we identify that there is a youth population, instead of bringing a big bulk of money to build the road or the port and give to pro-profit big company that are risk averse, conflict prevention means localization. Therefore, the solution is separate the big bulk of resources into small pockets, small budgets, and give to the different use groups. Therefore, there would not be competition against them. They will perceive the whole vision, what's being built, also a sense of belonging. So not only they will benefit from the road, from the port, and the water cleaning facility, but they will feel that belong to them. Therefore, they will protect that asset. They will not destroy in case of an unhappy situation. That is a clear case, simple. It doesn't require more money. It's how we structure. How do we give voice and power?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
We've got about 5 minutes left. I think it's just enough time for a quick question from Mr. Newman.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was going to ask questions about localisation decentralisation, which you've answered them very well. Can I commend both of you for your submissions? They're very, very good. I'm going to ask a question really on the transparency, integrity, anti-corruption issues, where you make the point, Dr. Watts, that where state institutions are weak, corruption is a driver of fragility. Supporting transparency in public financial management ensures national resources are going towards the people rather than the elites. I'm interested in how we can do that in practical terms. Are you talking about electoral reform? Are you talking about public accounts and audit committees? Are you talking about ensuring that their parliamentary democracy, the role of oppositions are respected? Are you talking about integrity of the judiciary? What are you talking about in particular? And how can we help?
Wow, I could answer. I would need another session to go through all those points that you just mentioned. At the beginning of your question, I was thinking of one way of answering. Now I'll shift and I'll answer in another way that I just think of. In my book, not that I'm here to promote my book, but just a statement of evidence. Indeed, the lack of democracy or the lack of state presence in governance institution is a source of fragility, is a source of conflict. In that perspective, yes, I would advocate for more democratic governance support, for example, through electoral identification models, not to impose a certain electoral political model, but to facilitate on, as for example, as international observers, help with the counting of the votes. There are many ways that you helping the political parties that mostly in fragile settings, they are puppets of armed rebels. Here I'm thinking of many countries a little bit far from our region of influence. Another way that I could answer your question is what I call the governance matched funding. To avoid corruption or minimize corruption, which is a driver of fragility, for an amount of resources that Australian development aid would focus, a certain amount should be allocated to watchdogs. They should be independent, they should be assessed, and they, at the local level, would be the one flagship if there is corruption. That will help to give transparency, accountability, and again, avoid conflict by dismantling the elites' competition.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we are now at time for this session. So thank you for your time today. You'll be sent a proof transcript of your evidence and you'll be able to request corrections to any transcription errors. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions taken on notice, please forward your response to the Secretariat within 2 weeks of receiving the proof transcript. If members of the committee have further questions that they did not get a chance to ask, please provide these to the Secretariat by the end of this week for forwarding to the witnesses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you.
Yes, lovely to meet you.
I now welcome representatives from the Asia Foundation and Search for Common Ground to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? If we could start with representatives from the Asia Foundation.
Thank you. I'm Laurel Miller. I'm President and CEO of the Asia Foundation, joining you from San Francisco.
I'm Thomas. I'm Vice President, Strategic Partnerships for the Asia Foundation, based in Bangkok.
I'm Petty Yates. I'm the Asia Foundation's Australia representative based in Perth.
Thank you. Search for Common Ground.
Hello, I'm Shamal Idris. I'm the CEO of Search for Common Ground, calling in from Washington, D.C.
Thank you all. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Witnesses giving evidence from overseas should be aware that whilst they are entitled to the protections of parliamentary privilege in Australia, with respect to the evidence that they give, these protections may not extend to another country. I now invite a representative of each organisation to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and responding to each question. If a representative from the Asia Foundation could get us started. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurel Miller from the Asia Foundation here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. I thought I'd start with a few observations about how we can think about what conflict prevention means as a conceptual framing that gives rise to practical ideas and may help you to organize a large number of ideas that the committee has been in receipt of. And so a few thoughts about some of the key dimensions of what conflict prevention means. The first is the idea that it's advantageous to keep relatively smaller problems small, either to prevent hot conflict from breaking out or to limit escalation. The second dimension is being prepared to engage quickly to diffuse conflict risks or initial outbreaks of conflict. That means having the kinds of systems and capabilities needed for rapid responsiveness. A third dimension is using development assistance joined up with diplomacy in places and in ways that provides deterrence. So thinking of development cooperation as explicitly as one of your deterrence tools. And a fourth dimension is using development cooperation together with other tools of forging connectedness and creating influence in order for Australia to be a partner of choice so that it can work with and through partners to prevent conflict. And I mean a partner both bilaterally, but also a partner to regional multilateral forums and minilateral forums. So those are a few kind of organizing constructs for the kinds of comments that we provided in our written submission that we'll speak to today, but most likely for other ideas that have been brought to you. Your inquiry is especially timely now because we are seeing clear increase in levels of conflict in Asia and the Pacific in the last few years. And that follows on about a decade or so in which Asia Pacific escaped the wider global trend of rising conflict. This concerns both internal conflicts in the region as well as some interstate conflicts. And the reasons are varied. They include geopolitical tensions that filter down to the national level, increases in political polarization that we're seeing in so many countries, mass frustration with growing inequality, intentional use of disinformation, and other drivers as well. But those are some of the key ones that you see in a number of countries. The contexts and the reasons for rising conflict are, of course, diverse, and that means that a range of responses and potential responses is needed in order to be addressing this growth in conflict. Among the kinds of responses that in our view, would be advantageous for Australia to consider would be building the resilience of smaller states in the region so that they can better withstand external pressures, strengthening the conflict resolution capabilities of regional bodies and of states in the region that are particularly constructive in this area, strengthening the reinforcing peace building capabilities of civic networks and at-risk communities, and finally enabling DFAT and other Australian actors to acquire and to sustain relevant tools and specialist skills in this area. I'll close these opening comments by reflecting, if I may, on some of my own direct experience with conflict prevention and conflict resolution. And the particular experience that I wanted to highlight was when I was involved in 2001 in Macedonia as the deputy U.S. negotiator in what was considered a real conflict prevention success in an incipient conflict that was nipped in the bud. That was almost a decade after a series of wars had broken out in the Balkans. And so the risk of escalation was really quite profound. And just a few lessons that I drew from that experience. One, and this would be, I think, foremost among the lessons, was the importance of speed of response. The US, the EU, key European partners responded quite quickly and assertively to engage in conflict prevention negotiations. I would say this was an example of keeping smaller conflicts small. The second lesson was combining diplomacy with a very clear and explicit prospect of development assistance and other kinds of assistance that would be used to support consolidation of the results of negotiations. And a third was having not only skilled negotiators, but also key partners who were working hand in hand with unified, truly unified purpose and action. And that required having already extant relationships of trust to lean on. And so I think you see in these experiences what I referred to earlier is the importance of partnerships, the importance of capabilities, and the importance of having those capabilities readily at hand in order to respond quickly. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Search for Common Ground. Would you like to make an opening statement?
Yes, thank you. Shamal Idris with Search for Common Ground. Thank you, Chairman Watson, to the honorable members of the subcommittee for inviting my participation. Search for Common Ground is a global peacebuilding organization that has worked for over 40 years to prevent and end violent conflict. Today, we work across more than 30 countries in some of the most challenging conflict contexts in the world to develop lasting solutions that are grounded in the needs of local communities. Over the last 5 years, we've watched the number and intensity of armed conflicts double worldwide. Wars in the Middle East, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo have all intensified, and chronic instability and violence persist in the Sahel, Haiti, Nigeria, Central Asia, the Central African Republic. These conflicts and the failure to end them are having a terrible human and financial cost. And with the world facing so many conflicts and such high levels of violence, we see a critical role for countries like Australia to step further into the conflict prevention space and play a strong role in addressing ongoing violence. We have seen firsthand at Search for Common Ground that investments made by Australia foster lasting impact in fragile states, including to bolster resilience, strengthen community and civic participation and governance, and enhance peace outcomes. In Sri Lanka, we partnered with DFAT to strengthen the political participation and leadership of women, leading to a significant improvement in women's ability to engage in local governance. And conflict prevention investments such as early warning systems, participatory governance, local mediation networks have proven effective in reducing violence, intervening before crises turn more violent, building trust, and promoting social cohesion. Preventing violence also, of course, has economic benefits. Research indicates that every dollar invested in preventing violent conflict can save more than $100 in conflict-related costs. And more stable countries, of course, are more attractive for investment, whether that's for Australian companies or for the local private sector in those countries. At Search for Common Ground, we always emphasize that peace is built at the speed of trust. That process looks different in every context, but the results endure because diverse communities build and maintain those solutions together. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just start, both of your submissions emphasised the importance of the use of flexible approaches in our development and aid programming, with an emphasis on the need to move quickly in response to changing conditions. In the Asia Foundation's submission, you state that our development programs and strategies need to be able to, quote, adapt to rapidly changing conditions, and SCG submissions echo this by recommending that Australian programs, quote, rapidly seize opportunities to de-escalate conflicts with quick, modest interventions supported by local knowledge. Can I ask, given the global perspective of your respective organisations, how Australia performs relative to other major donor countries in this respect? Who is best practice around the world in providing this kind of flexible, responsive conflict prevention type interventions? And how does Australia compare with our peers in this respect?
I'd be happy to start if you like. I think Australia rates quite well in that regard, and I can give you a specific example in our own experience working with DFAT. In Nepal, we have a very large program focused on subnational governance strengthening. And in that instance, when the political upheaval occurred there, we were able to very quickly engage with DFAT to make some changes to the program, to have some differences in points of emphasis. And it was really quite effective, and a genuine dialogue between us and DFAT. And I would say DFAT really lives the partnership model of its development cooperation in our experience. So in general terms, I think quite good. And I would also say, having met with diplomatic missions from many countries all over the world, I personally really see the benefits for Australia of the diplomacy and assistance merger and combination. And you see Australian ambassadors who are fluent in the development cooperation programs in their countries, and you see counselors who are responsible for development cooperation, who are present in the room with the diplomats and speaking in a very joined up way. And I frankly use the Australia example frequently in Washington, particularly in the current environment, in telling people, as USAID has been merged into the State Department, people should really be looking to Australia's experience. And that speaks to that. That is part of what creates that potential for flexibility, because it means that the development cooperation program is really embedded in a foreign policy approach, and is approached with a foreign policy lens. In terms of conflict prevention and conflict resolution specifically, I have to say the Norwegians are standout in this regard, as they've invested in creating and sustaining capabilities in terms of a unit within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that's responsible for peace and conflict issues, that is well resourced, and that has diplomats who are working in that area for a sustained period of time, and they have a kind of stick-to-itiveness in their approach to conflict prevention and conflict resolution that I think is probably best in class, at least in my experience. The UK is pretty good at it as well, in terms of analytical resources and how they invest in understanding conflict drivers, conflict dimensions, and how they contribute in a kind of strategic sense on those issues. I wouldn't say that they necessarily resource the programmatic aspects of conflict prevention and conflict resolution. So in a way, they a little bit punch above their weight just because they have in the past, but this is definitely diminishing, invested in the analytical and strategic strategy making resources. But I think we're going to see that less and less true over time with their development aid cuts.
Shamal Idris again for Search for Common Ground. I would say our experience with DFAT has been similar. In preparing for this testimony and touching base with our Sri Lanka team, they specifically referenced DFAT's pivoting around the Ditwa cyclone last year, showing a great deal of flexibility and agility to adjust to the needs that the country was facing. I'm sure the Asia Society representatives could tell horror stories as we can about extraordinarily rigid approaches that don't allow for even the most basic pivots in the middle of something like an Ebola crisis, where you have funding sitting that you literally cannot apply. We've even been in the case where a government has asked us to serve the lead coordinating role in Sierra Leone, but we could not pay for it out of any of the grants that we had. DFAT has been quite positive in that regard. I would say, in answer to your question about best examples, this waxes and wanes in our experience. Different governments come to the fore at different times. I would reiterate what's been already said about Norway and also Switzerland in terms of using their good offices and applying their diplomatic talents along with whatever development assistance is provided. But currently, I would say probably our best experience, among our best experiences, are with the Dutch government. Unusually and uniquely right now, the Dutch government is providing very long-term and with support with great deal of flexibility and a priority emphasis on learning across multiple countries. We have one 8-year grant across multiple countries where there's a learning forward approach that allows for a very open exchange regularly on what are we learning along the way and how can it be applied to adapt programming. So that's been the case with the Netherlands right now. But our experience with DFAT, again, has been generally positive in this regard. And being able to respond quickly and flexibly is one of 4 key capacities that we have been advocating with the governments that support us, particularly when they're going through integration of bureaucracies or dissolution of bureaucracies, that whatever one does, they can all work, but there are really 4 capacities that need to be addressed, and this is just one of them.
Thank you. Mr. Batt, do you have a question?
Thanks for that, Chair. Just trying to get back online. Yeah, probably just to start with the Asia Foundation. I do have one for both if we've got time. In the submission, you talk about the current global environment offers less opportunity for Australia to back coordinated peace-building responses, such as those that we have deployed in the Solomons and or Timor. Can you just give us a bit of background on why your thoughts are on that now and how we can better deploy in the future?
I could better deploy sorry, you said in future contingencies?
Yeah, well, just because you're basically saying that we can't, our current global environments, we've got less opportunity to back that peace building response. So how can we do that better? What's the reason for that and how can we do it better to get back to that?
I'm going to also invite any of my colleagues who are here, so we have 3 of them now, to jump in. Anyone want to?
Yeah.
Yes, I can. Adam, did you want to?
Adam, we can't hear you.
Well, I think the reference, while he's unmuting, I think the reference relates predominantly to just changes in the multilateral system and weakening of the multilateral system that makes it more difficult for mounting those kinds of international interventions and engagements. Tom, did you want to add anything to that?
Can you hear me now? Is that coming through?
Yes, Adam, we can hear you
now
now.
we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. I'm calling in from a small hotel room in Cambodia where I'm in the middle of a large but very, very low-key meeting about conflict in Myanmar.
Adam, you have to say your name for the record.
I'm Adam Burke. I'm with the Asia Foundation, and I'm the director of conflict regionally, so covering Asia and the Pacific as the Asia Foundation does. There's many aspects of what the question was just putting forward. The broader perspective of why that's the case is that international community consensus around international peace-building missions and that whole machinery is largely not there in the way that it was at the time of a range of Australian missions in Cambodia, in the Solomon Islands, in Timor-Leste, and so on. So we're in a very different environment, as I'm sure many people recognise. How one responds to that is challenging, and I think it involves immense flexibility, as we just heard from Search for Common Ground and the Asia Foundation. And I think it involves trying to equip oneself with as many tools as possible, because it's unlikely you're going to have a straightforward process of an international peacekeeping mission or any other single response. One needs to look at all the different tools of engagement or of statecraft and of development that one can try and take forward. And that involves development angles. It involves engaging, if possible, over a long period of time with a whole range of different counterparts, from governments down to non-governmental bodies and up to regional organizations, and sifting through that to work out where the entry points are, especially if one's working at prevention rather than acting after a conflict has blown up. None of that is straightforward. I think the initial starting point for all of that is the analysis, both in terms of conflict monitoring and understanding what the entry points and opportunities are, which is a long-term, hard process that does involve investments. And then that linking up between bodies of government or with people outside the government who can provide the specialist input when it comes around to specific particular tools, whether it's through a development approach or a diplomatic approach or other angles. And I've seen Australia do a lot of that very well in places, but inevitably there's a lot more that can be done.
Thank you. I've got another question, Chair, just to both Asia Foundation and Search. Both in your submissions you talk about deliberately designing aid to reduce conflict and focusing on fragile states and root causes of conflict. Can you give us any ideas on what causes of conflict that we in Australia should be prioritising in our region and why?
Do you want to, Shamil, do you want to go first? Yeah.
Yeah. So again, Shamil just Search for Common Ground. One of the greatest challenges that we're seeing globally, as well as in your region, is the impact of the information ecosystem, the polarizing the impact it's having, the impact on disinformation. I genuinely question whether some of the very powerful movements that inspired me to get into this field in the first place, the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, the Northern Ireland peace process, even the civil rights movement in my own country, whether they would succeed in today's information environment. It has become that difficult to build and maintain a diverse constituency, and the erosion of social trust as a result of that information ecosystem is universal. Everywhere from the youth with whom we engage in Mali, who complain about the amount of recruitment to extremist groups that their friends are facing, the targeting of minority communities, scapegoating of minority communities, the spreading of misinformation, all happening on anonymous platforms like WhatsApp, all the way up through to heads of state who are challenged with how to negotiate peace agreements in this kind of a context. And we've seen a huge resurgence or surge and increasing attention to the specific impact of misogyny online and the impact that's having on violent extremism. This is an issue that requires leadership from countries across multiple regions to tackle. There are some good practices being put in place, but I will say that from our perspective right now, it sometimes feels like putting sandbags in front of a tsunami. It needs a much more sustained and multilateral effort to tackle the issue. And of course, in your region, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Myanmar, there are plenty of examples of how this has played out to the most devastating effects.
I would add to that, I would agree with all of that and add to it that what we see in Asia and the Pacific is these new dimensions layered on top of old ones. And so many of the recent outbreaks of violence, of political upheaval that has been violent in the region, and including some of the interstate violence in the region, is really familiar. And much of it relates to problems of governance, poor quality governance. And you can break that down as service delivery, of urban governance problems, of policymaking systems that are absent or sclerotic and that are not responsive to public needs, of lack of mechanisms for citizen state engagement so that government and systems of government are responsive to what the public wants and needs, or has any idea of what the public wants. And of course, corruption. And there are other dimensions as well, but those are some of the dimensions of governance that, of poor governance in the region, that regularly leads to frustration and social tensions, and can break out into violence. And those are also some of the areas where Australia is, and I would urge should continue to be attentive to how it uses its development cooperation resources. I think part of the challenge here is identifying not just what's driving conflict, but what are the drivers of conflict that you can potentially do something about. And working on systems of governance and quality of governance is an area where there is something you can do that you can work to address. And it's quite varied. It requires also an understanding of, in a particular society, what is the nature of the violence, what is driving it? Is it at the subnational level? Is it at national level politics? And the responses need to be tailored to the particular dimensions of conflict risk.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Zapier in the room, do you have a question?
Thanks, Tim. My question is to Mr. Idris from Search for Common Ground. Mr. Idris, in your submission, you talk about, or at least the submission talks about, a Women in Learning and Leadership project in Sri Lanka almost 10 years ago. Can you tell me a little bit about the program, or very briefly about the program, but more importantly, what gains were made from it, and were those gains lasting?
Yes, so this began with supporting women to come together initially in women-only settings to discuss the issues that are of greatest concern to them, the pathways that were open and not open to them to influence governance on those issues. We have used in Sri Lanka and everywhere that we work, media to try to contribute and foster and complement the work that we're doing at the community level. So it also included radio programming that was intended to foster not just a platforming of women's voices, but an encouragement of what you might call positive masculinity, a greater acceptance of women's leadership. Probably the most concrete result was the passing in, and I can get you, I don't have it before me, but it was in at least 3 local districts, 25% quota of women's participation in local legislatures. And that was quite concrete and a significant increase from what had been the case before. I think it's fair to say that investment by DFAT, that support, not only generally contributed to women's participation in Sri Lanka, but directly influenced the level of women's participation in governance to this day.
Okay. And Tim, my other question, and it goes to both the submissions, we're seeing more conflict throughout the world now than I think ever before, certainly from some statistics that I've seen. Can both of you, again, very briefly, just tell me, why do you think that is the case?
At the risk of overemphasizing any one issue, I do want to return to this issue of the information ecosystem. I think it is not a coincidence that as first social media platforms and then increasingly polarizing and targeted information systems became ubiquitous and every year become more so. In theory, we can all now subscribe to more sources of information than ever before. In practice, we tend to subscribe to the sources of information that reinforce our pre-existing biases. And we are, it is very challenging. I agree completely with the point that was made by the other speaker about governance, but it is very difficult. I don't think I have to tell any one of you on the subcommittee that it's quite difficult to govern much of anything these days. Going to the UN General Assembly last year and all the discussions about reform that are needed, that those discussions have been having for a very long time, I would agree with them, but it's very difficult to imagine a real reform of governance at the global level when governance at every level under it is being challenged and is dissipating and I think the primary challenge has been an information ecosystem that now is causing people to question what is true and to lose trust in one another. It's obviously used by the very empowering system as well, but we are, we're living in the age of YouTube's motto of broadcast yourself, where everybody is broadcasting and a few people are listening. And of course, these tools can then be used by authoritarian governments to squash dissent. And it can be used by pretty much everyone else to erode trust. And I think if I were to look at one primary issue that we need to address, it would be that one.
Thank you.
I would add to that I fully agree about the erosion of trust, but I think we also have to look at what is facilitating, what is making people susceptible and social structures susceptible to that erosion of trust. I do think it's important to remember that conflict is rising from a period of historically low levels of conflict. In the post-Cold War era or the later post-Cold War era. So, it's possible that what we're seeing here is at least partly, if not largely, a reversion to norm. That doesn't mean that there aren't new drivers or specific drivers, but that historical perspective, I do think, is important. And maybe we can also look at what happened during that period of time with historically low levels of conflict. I would say we saw a kind of complacency about the value of values, complacency about the value of international structures, norms, and institutions that had been helpful in reinforcing the importance of principles of conflict prevention, conflict resolution. It's not that long ago that certain articles of faith about how countries in the international system would react in response to rising conflict risks now seem quite quaint and outdated. And so that's not to say that there's nothing that can be done about it and that these are inevitable historical trends, but I do think it's valuable to reflect on them. Adam, I don't know if there's anything you want to maybe add to. There are, of course, many specific drivers you can point to, but why are so many drivers actually gaining traction at the current time is, I think, part of the question.
Okay, Adam Burke again. I'll be extremely brief because between you two, you've covered a lot of it. There are, of course, many factors at play, but the massive change to the international order, collapse of what academics call a liberal peace, right? Expectations of both of norms and of actual behaviours underwritten by the UN, by the multilateral community, which itself was quite strongly guided in this direction by the US in particular and a range of its allies across the world. That situation no longer pertains, right? So you're dealing with a very, very different terrain. That maps right down to the local level in many, many different ways. but they're quite hard to trace and often very specific. But I think that is one of the key drivers across the board, as well as online spaces and other challenges. In order to tackle that, one has to look at what's going on locally or nationally and where one can find the entry points to constructively engage. And that's the challenge for Australia, especially in its nearby region.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Zapier. Mr. Rebello.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question for the Asia Foundation and then a question for Search. So in the recommendations from the Asia Foundation, one of those was to diversify financing sources to reduce borrowing nations' over-reliance on a single creditor. And you'd provided some examples in relation to blending financing credit arrangements and other measures that we can facilitate Australian investment. I was just wondering, this is obviously something that's very important to Australia from a strategic perspective in our region, and we are seeing a particular player taking on the role of that single creditor. So do you have any examples for us of that diversification occurring effectively in other countries through other aid programs? Is there something in practice that Australia can adopt to incentivise recipient countries to, support our view of a strengthened, diversified funding regime?
I think, and some of my colleagues may want to jump in as well. Tom, maybe you do after I answer. This is Laurel Miller again. What we see is that there is not a reluctance on the part of the vast majority of states in Asia and the Pacific to have a diversified set of partnerships. We see a lot of active interest in when the opportunity is there to have a diversified set of partnerships. So it's really about the availability of those resources to countries, not about resistance on the part of the recipients. They generally, and I'm generalizing across the region, but I do think this holds in most cases, they don't want to be dependent on one larger actor or another. They want to have the potential of having more independence in their foreign policy and to be able to not have to choose sides in the wider geopolitical contestation. So I think by and large, it's an open door. I mean, we are able to work in really any country throughout Asia and the Pacific that you might imagine working in, including ones that are closer to other partners in the region than Australia and ones that are close to Australia. And the door is fairly open to that. Tom, do you want to add anything here, or Peter?
Sure. Thomas Parks, Vice President, Asia Foundation. I think that's right. There's a range of things that are happening right now as countries try to maintain autonomy and prevent themselves from becoming more vulnerable to a single creditor. Some examples of this in the high-speed rail build-out in the region, for example. Thailand made the decision after negotiating with the Chinese that they would self-finance the build-out of a high-speed rail line between Bangkok and Nong Khai that connects to Laos. In the case of Vietnam, they decided to find other financiers for the main high-speed rail line from Hanoi to Ho Chi Minh City. There was a separate, smaller line where they agreed for the Chinese to be the main source of finance, but they were very explicit that in the main area build-out that they would find a consortium of financiers that was actually 30% was domestically financed as well. So countries are very aware of this. Of course, there's wide diversity in terms of the ability of countries, given their fiscal position, given their proximity to China, to be able to do this. But even countries, for example, Laos is looking for a range of new partners in technical assistance, in other areas as well, to help them broaden and diversify their partnerships. Australia has played an important role in this. For example, Australia's role in helping the Lao energy sector to think about its future and how it can, develop. That has been supported by Australian assistance through technical assistance under the Partnerships for Infrastructure project. So there's a range of possibilities and approaches, but there's clear direction in Southeast Asia in particular to try to move it in this way.
Thank you. And my second question directed at search. So in your submission, you speak about how evidence from global programs shows conflict prevention is effective when it includes targeted efforts to counter misinformation. Now, that's something I think as politicians we're all seeing a lot of at the moment. I'm just curious if you've got any examples again of what those targeted efforts would look like, and do we have instances of countries doing that effectively, especially in relation to the aid program?
Sure, I can share several examples, but I'll choose one. It wasn't directly as a result of the DFAT support for media work in Sri Lanka, but it followed on that a few years later. You may recall the Easter Sunday bombings that happened, I believe, in 2019 in Sri Lanka. Our organization before that, for years, had been using primarily broadcast media to complement all of our community-based work. So hundreds of hours of everything from reality television to soap opera programming on TV and radio, finding that it was a very effective way to go broad while the community outreach went deep. With of course, the advent of the internet and social media, broadcast media that could reach everybody started to decline, and you started getting much more segmented audiences. And the team in Sri Lanka pioneered something that we're actually developing into a bit of a template to support our teams elsewhere that want to adapt it. They identified quite a limited number, I believe it was 20 social media influencers who collectively reached 75% of the user base in Sri Lanka, a huge proportion of the population of the country. None of these people were doing content that had anything to do with peace and conflict. You're talking about, cricket and music and cooking, the things that people actually care about, and but our team worked with these 20 or so influencers and said, hey, collectively, you actually have quite a bit of power in a country that's still emerging and recovering from a civil war. There are sometimes tensions that erupt. If you're interested, we could support you to work together to mobilize and reach your audiences if and when the time comes. To make a long story short, this group took on the moniker Cyber Guardians, which they were quite proud of. And within hours of an attack that was kind of triggering some of the very same bloodlust that we had seen right after those Easter Sunday bombings, a government official went on television and repeated a rumor that 11 police, I believe, had been killed in a Muslim-majority region, which hadn't happened. He didn't do it on purpose. He didn't know it was a rumor. He repeated something on national television. And the Cyber Guardians mobilized to get accurate information out that this actually hadn't happened. And later that very same day, the same government official went back on television, called for calm, corrected his mistake, apologized. This is the kind of thing that, you can no longer rely on necessarily one-to-many broadcast, but if you can partner with and mobilize networks of information sharers. And this is not just in digital media. Probably the most effective information dissemination network that our team now mobilizes in Kenya is tens of thousands of boda boda riders. These are the moto taxi riders, which there are over 1 million. And our team has formed a bit of a union and coalition of over 40,000 of them in eastern Kenya that when information needs to get out, when rumors are spreading and things that there needs to be things calm down, they mobilize through those kinds of networks as well. So this is everything from the most analog to the most interactive digital. But as was said by the other speaker earlier, each of these things has to be so locally context specific. But we're seeing more and more opportunities, and we are one of 5 now of the initial anchor partners of the Christchurch call on preventing extremist content online from triggering offline or real world violence. that Emmanuel Macron and Jacinda Ardern, launched. I believe Ardern is now relocated to Australia, actually. So we're seeing more and more. We're part of a number of consortia that are trying to innovate in this space.
Thank you. That's all from me, Chair.
Thank you. I'll take the call back now. One of the themes that has come up repeatedly amongst witnesses is this distinction between implicit experience-based understanding of conflict dynamics in a region and explicit frameworks informed by evidence, academic research about conflict prevention. Both of your submissions go to the risks of inadvertently fueling conflict through development programs. I think the SCG submission talks about the need to provide conflict smart aid. Asia Foundation warns about the wrong kind of development approaches exacerbating conflict drivers through elite capture of resources, grievances over lack of representation. We've heard from the different arms of the Australian government in defence, in diplomacy, in development, that they interact regularly, like on a daily basis, about potential conflict risks. But much of this interaction is through implicit understandings of what the drivers of conflict are in specific contexts. Some witnesses have argued that there's a need in that context to overlay an explicit, agreed understanding of what conflict prevention requires across those different arms of effort. From your experience in the field around the world, do you have a view on this distinction between articulating an explicit conflict prevention framework that everyone can get on the same page on versus more implicit cooperation models around conflict prevention issues?
Well, I'll jump in, Laurel Miller here. I think anything that tries to create a one-size-fits-all analytical approach is generally problematic. That's not to say that you couldn't have a conflict prevention framework that might help you think through some issues, but to my mind, it's more about what kind of approach you take to your development cooperation planning and engagement than it is specific sort of how-tos, because it's about taking what we refer to, and we engage quite regularly with DFAT on this and provide training to DFAT on taking a political economy approach to designing your development cooperation programs and strategies and specific actions. And that means looking at where's the power in that society? Who's going to benefit? Who are you working with? Know who you're working with. Who's going to benefit from the results of your development programming? It's about those kind of methodologies of approach and analysis that are going to bring forward the kind of information that's going to enable you to understand whether your engagement is more conflict suppressing or risks encouraging conflict dimensions, as opposed to specific, look for this, look for that kind of frameworks. My colleague Tom Parks may have a little bit to add from some of his direct experience on this as well.
Sure. Just one example, Thomas Parks, Asia Foundation. Another way of thinking about this is that, for example, the role that ASEAN plays in some ways fits both models. For example, ASEAN creates formal structures and monitoring mechanisms to try to intervene and to try to cut off escalation of conflicts. But at the same time, ASEAN also, through its regularity of engagement and platforms and officials meeting on a regular basis, becoming first name and very familiar with each other, developing relationships, also helps to build that kind of informal connection that is so valuable in a crisis. And so the Pacific Island Forum in many ways operates even more informally and in that way. So I do think that there are ways of thinking about it. It sort of that combines the two ways of thinking about conflict to build on what President Miller just said. Thank you.
And we've actually worked with DFAT on some specific conflict prevention guides and that also relate to their engagement in fragile states. And Peter, do you want to say a quick word about that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been working with those for the last couple of years, providing them. I would also just say, I think we do have something to learn from our defence colleagues here who do this and invest in this very, very well. So I'm a visiting fellow at the Australian War College there in Canberra, and when I go and provide training there, the cohort there is always 2/3 Australian defence officials and 1/3 defence officials from the region. And so while it's not about investing in an explicit framework, every senior Australian defence official I speak to reference the importance of that cohort that they go through that training with, not only to look for opportunities for working together, but also to have those hard conversations. So you have a shared language and knowledge of training that's gone on across defence officials across the region. And you could imagine Australia investing some similar capabilities when it comes to de-escalation, conflict negotiation or resolution opportunities through the development investments as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think I guess I would address two sides of this. One is the question about the utility of having a government policy or framework that tries to ensure a greater information sharing coordination around single frameworks, whatever it might be. I know in the United States, we were very excited in 2019 when the US Congress passed the Global Fragility Act on a bipartisan basis that for the first time intended to align the defense and diplomatic and development parts of the government around coordinated response specifically in fragile states, with the diplomacy, the State Department taking the lead. Given all that's changed since then, that is not being fully implemented. There were issues with it, whatever, but it in a large bureaucracy, in a large government, I would put it this way, I think it is definitely useful to have a policy or a tool that is explicitly trying to foster regular coordination across those 3 Ds. On the level of frameworks, the need for highly local contextualization, but also the challenge for policymakers or others of looking for frameworks that they can apply across different contexts. We have been thrilled, frankly, in recent years by the uptake of an impact framework. The UN Peacebuilding Support Office is coming out with their first annual report on peace impact and asked us to author the chapter on localization, in part referencing this. It's an impact framework that essentially identifies, and I do think that we know enough now that we can put forward what I would call are the vital signs of a healthy society as it relates to conflict dynamics, not as it relates to all good things. There would probably be hundreds of vital signs. But there are 5 vital signs in particular that we look at everywhere, from the United States, where we currently have our largest single country program, to Afghanistan. And those 5 vital signs are intercommunal trust, whether that's across ethnicities, political parties, racial groups, whatever it might be. Institutional trust or legitimacy. Do people trust the institutions that govern and serve them? Do they trust the police? Do they trust the judiciary? Doesn't just have to be government. Do they trust the media? Third is levels of physical violence, because violence begets more violence. More prisons, more guns, more things that reflect a response to conflict that's already gotten out of control? Or is it going to things that feed these other indicators in a positive direction? The population of a framework like that, to make it relevant to local context, has to then come from sources that are not just universal. We draw our sourcing of the data for that framework comes from 3 places where there are universal indicators, like the UN office that tracks levels of violence in every country in the world. We utilize them. That's one. The second is experts on the ground, scholars, people who know the context well. But the third is then local stakeholders. community members themselves, the police themselves, articulating what success would look like. And this is where a lot of the local contextualization comes in, with examples like in Sri Lanka, people saying, if I hear another language late at night and I'm not scared, that would be success. In Myanmar, people literally saying, if people start building with cinder blocks rather than mud, I know that they're not fearful they're going to have to get up and run. These are incredibly context-specific responses that need to populate a framework like that in order to make it relevant. But we cannot continue to just say everything is local, 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 because without recognizing the need to identify and track some indicators. This is the best framework that we've seen, and we utilize it. And one of the last thing I'll say on it, probably the best indicator that has some relevance to it is that our teams, we are a very decentralized organization with the local leadership of our teams determining everything in terms of what will happen on the ground. The fact that so many of those local teams have really embraced this framework where they wouldn't embrace anything if it were just rolled out from headquarters has been really valuable for us. And we're also seeing many other organizations and actually some governments now utilizing it as well.
Could I just add, I think you also want to think about scalable approaches, because utilizing some frameworks can be pretty demanding on your people. And so thinking about having approaches that are suited to what your resource and capabilities are in particular environments is really important to be practical about it.
Thank you. I believe Mr. Newman just had a follow-up question on this issue.
Yeah, I was a bit puzzled, the Asia Foundation, by the first two paragraphs in section 4 on page 3 of your submission, where you talk about the weakening of international consensus, you talk about deterioration in terms of war and coercion, and then you commend ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum, where you talk, which has a long history of non-intervention. Myanmar is the best example of the failure of ASEAN to help resolve an issue. When you speak to any of those governments or any ambassadors or in relation to it, you can see there's a real, almost a hands-off approach. And then instead of, say, looking at a more sort of a bigger picture approach, and history has shown some of them are successful and not successful. Treaty of Versailles wasn't very successful, whereas the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars, was very successful for nearly a century. I thought you might go down that road, but instead you go down the road, and I'm quoting from you, that we should look at, in terms of resolving conflicts and escalating coercion, go down the road of new mini-lateral platforms for state cooperation and norm setting on regional security issues. So I'm interested in saying, what do you mean by that? And how can we participate in that role? Are you suggesting we create new organisations beyond ASEAN and the Pacific Islands Forum? And if so, what would they look like? How would they work?
Tom, did you want to jump in there?
Sure. Thomas Parks, Asia Foundation. Great question, sir. I think that our answer on that was motivated in part by the deterioration or the challenges faced by the international system, particularly the UN system, and its ability to provide that kind of intervention or leadership in the local level in the Asia-Pacific region. I think that our main point was that there is a bit more of a shift now to focus on regional actors, for example, ASEAN and the Pacific Island Forum, as an alternative. And we're seeing this, for example, in Myanmar, where the UN has been quite challenged in its ability to play a leading role in the response. Yet ASEAN, despite some of the challenges in responding, has been able to play a key central role in the international response to what's happening in the civil war in Myanmar. So that's part of it. I don't think that we're saying that what's needed is the creation of new mechanisms in the region, but we are noting that there is a proliferation of particularly security-focused minilaterals focused on maritime issues and other areas that is creating sort of a web of cooperation between countries in the region, in Asia and the Pacific, and outside the region, including, Australia's engagement with countries in the region is taking many, many forms right now. So I think that what we're basically saying is that the structures that are ready to go in terms of responding to crises, in the past, we would have been more reliant on the UN. Now it's going to be important to have more mechanisms, particularly those that are more locally grounded and regional, like ASEAN and the Pacific Islands.
So you mean effectively, say, issues-based, maritime, transnational crime, migration, those sorts of, a more sort of issues-based approach between countries. Is that what you're meaning by the new multilateral platforms? Is that what you mean?
Yes, to some extent. A lot of the new structures that are being created are issue specific, like maritime security, and among other issues. But some of them are not, like ASEAN and Pacific Island Forum. And so it's, I guess the main point is that there's a proliferation of structures that are going to be needed, and that Australia's overall response is already starting to invest in multiple of those structures, and that probably is a sensible approach.
Thanks, Tim.
Including the Quad, including AUKUS, as examples of multilateral platforms.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I would frame overall what we say.
You would include AUKUS and the Quad as part of those mini.
Yes, as part of that web of smaller structures, and I would put the overall frame around this of you have to work with what you've got. And ASEAN may be imperfect, but it's and Pacific Island Forum is imperfect, but that's the material there is to work with in the region.
Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you. We're now at time for this session, so we might bring it to a close. Thank you, witnesses, for your time today. You'll be sent a proof transcript of your evidence, and you'll be able to request corrections to any transcription errors. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions taken on notice, please forward your response to the Secretariat within 2 weeks of receiving the proof transcript. If members of the committee have further questions that they did not get a chance to ask, please provide these to the Secretariat by the end of this week for forwarding to the witnesses. We will now suspend the hearing for a short break and we'll return at 3 p.m. Thank you. the public hearing. I now welcome representatives from the Institute for Economics and Peace to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, could you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is David Hammond. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Economics and Peace.
And I'm Sachin Lowe, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Economics and Peace.
Thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and detracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite a representative to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions. To assist with the transcription of the hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and responding to each question. You may begin with an opening statement.
Thank you very much. Again, my name is David Hammond, Director of Research at the Institute for Economics and Peace. And I'd like to just have a little bit of an introduction to IEP for the committee. We're an Australian-based international think tank with offices in New York, The Hague, Nairobi, and most recently the Philippines. Founded in 2008, IEP is best known for our Global Peace Index report, which is used by financial firms, governments, and multilateral agencies worldwide. Our report releases are covered by outlets such as the BBC, the New York Times, and more locally, the ABC and the Guardian. We also partner and consult with organisations such as World Vision, UNDP, and the World Bank on how to measure peace and conflict. It's important to note that we are not an advocacy organisation. As a registered not-for-profit research organisation, our aim is to provide the best data-driven evidence on international trends and to do so apolitically. We have spent the past 20 years developing quantitative approaches to track and measure peacefulness. Our submission was motivated by a simple observation. With global uncertainty on the rise in recent history, the need to measure, track, and have informed debates on conflict prevention has never been greater. Every year, IEP estimates the impact of violence on the global economy. In the most recent Global Peace Index released last week, that impact totaled $22 trillion, around 10% of global GDP. For Australia, this number is not an abstraction. Recent supply shocks from the conflicts in Ukraine and Iran have reached the everyday lives of citizens. Yet prevention is far cheaper than response. Our research, cited in the World Bank and UN Pathways for Peace report, shows that every dollar spent on peace building saves 16 in response. In this light, ODA deployed effectively can act as a risk mitigation mechanism with a tangible economic impact. But peace is more than just the absence of violence. It requires its own set of factors to function. Understanding the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies has been core to IEP's research. It has led us to develop the Positive Peace Framework, which statistically derives 8 pillars of peace that the most peaceful countries in the world all have in common. Improving these factors have been shown to reduce the risk of conflict. Our submission therefore focuses on how to measure the effectiveness of Australia's ODA, primarily in the Pacific, in preventing conflict and building peace. However, data in the region is scarce. Without it, it is a challenge to preempt emerging risks, plan for contingencies, or know whether investments are working. If you can't measure something, how do you know you're having an impact? IEP's submission makes several recommendations, of which I will close this opening statement with 3. Firstly, it's important to define what to measure. Australia should adopt an agreed definition of peace across its policy framework, with measurable KPIs attached at the macro, meso, and micro levels, so that progress can be tracked. Second, invest in an evidence base, supporting the production of a new data and reporting capability on peace and conflict in the region. And third, to leverage the capability already available. Rather than building from scratch, Australia is uniquely placed to draw on internationally respected local and regional expertise and networks, including established peace and training programs in the region. With that, we both thank you for the opportunity to present and look forward to fielding any questions.
Thank you. Let me say from the outset, congratulations on the Global Peace Index 2026.
Thank you very much.
Your submission argues that Australia now accounts for over 40% of all official development finance to the Pacific, and that this dominant position is set to grow further as other Western donors retreat. You also note that Australia lacks systematic frameworks to measure peacebuilding effectiveness, and that conflict prevention remains implicit rather than explicit in how our development partnerships are designed. Can you help the committee to understand what the practical consequences of this are? How does operating without explicit conflict prevention frameworks actually affect program design and implementation on the ground? And how would making these things explicit change Australia's ODA programs in the Pacific?
Excellent question. So I think from where we sit, we work with a lot of government and agencies globally around similar types of questions. And the partners that we work with, tend to be in a similar position, but also recognise that having a framework for thinking and discussing and a language around peace building is a useful policy mechanism to coordinate and align on overall goals. Currently, we're working with Queen's University Belfast on what we're calling the Northern Ireland Peace Index. And what they're trying to do is, after 27 years of the Good Friday Agreement, is reinvigorate the language around peace, which up to this point has really been focused on essentially contact theory between different grieving parties. But what they're trying to do is elevate the language around that to be more encompassing, so that if you're part of the education department, you understand that your role is, yes, to provide education, but how that feeds into a broader goal of building peace within that region. So the benefits of having a sort of mainstreamed approach to the language of peace and the definition of peace allows different bodies of the government to design their programs with the broader goal in mind. Sorry, you're on mute.
Thank you. One of the tensions with between making these things explicit and allowing them to remain implicit, which is probably the predominant way that we do things at the moment between the various departments of Australia's efforts in the Pacific across defence, law enforcement, diplomacy, development, is the tension between the impact that has on our relationships with partners. Labelling societies or countries as conflict risk sites can affect relationships, can be perceived as paternalistic. How do you grapple with those trade-offs between the benefits of making things explicit in a coordination sense from our side of the equation versus potential downsides of that with partners?
Yeah. I think the answer from our experience is it depends on the levels that you're operating at. So, if I take the Northern Ireland example, that's operating at a, kind of public policy, general signalling that peace is important to the region, so on and so forth. Now, in that process, we have worked with them to develop data evidence on, peace within the region at a subnational level. Now, the intention of that is not to be made public for exactly this reason. So I think the coordination at a high level, there is benefit to having a language of peace, whatever that may be for Australia, explicit and well-defined as a central, a central tenet of what we're trying to achieve. And then, but yes, there needs to be a political decision made at what level other information is made public.
Okay. Your submission notes that Australia's governance-focused aid approach suffers from what you describe as a visibility gap compared to other donors whose infrastructure investments are physically present and visible in communities. and without ground truth feedback, Australia cannot know whether its investments are making an impact. You recommend peace-building investments be designed with visibility in mind and that community-level perception monitoring be built into the framework to track how Australian aid is experienced relative to other donors. How significant is this visibility problem? And is there a risk that Australia's most effective conflict prevention investments are also its least seen? And what would a deliberate strategy to close that gap look like without compromising the integrity of local ownership of the programs themselves?
No, I mean, great question. I think that particular comment in the submission came from some work that we've been doing around ODA over the past few years. Obviously, ODA has been front and centre to development conversations for certainly the past 24 months. And so this question of effective ODA has come to our attention through a number of different parties. And I think the interesting thing about that is that the visibility dimension is something that certainly we didn't think about until the past couple of years of asking the question, what does development look like now with a completely revised ODA framework globally? So I think in terms of answering it, I think the way to think about it is whatever investment is being made, having that localization socialized, in the planning and design phase is quite critical. So, I mean, the end impact may be, to use your term, invisible, but if the understanding locally of why that investment is beneficial, can help with the overall acceptance of the project and with this visibility approach.
Okay. So your submission also identifies what you call a critical data gap across. I think we're just getting some feedback here. Okay. So your submission also identifies what you call a critical data gap across almost all indicators of Pacific Island states, with many countries having no dedicated violence monitoring mechanisms at all. You argue that without adequate data, early warning systems cannot function, and preventative diplomacy lacks an evidence base, and programs cannot be properly targeted or evaluated. You also note that donors operate without shared data infrastructure, making burden-sharing discussions essentially blind. Can you outline for the committee how this plays out in practice? Are there specific examples of where the absence of data has led to coverage gaps or duplication or missed early warning signals that contribute to conflict risk?
Absolutely. The impetus for that particular section of the submission comes from a report that we were supported with by DFAT in 2016 to 2019, and it was on SDG 16, or measuring SDG 16 in the Pacific. The ultimate idea of that was to be able to have a set of metrics that could be tracked over time to, largely address some of the capability gaps that we mentioned in our submission. Now, the ultimate outcome of that body of work was, really documenting that, very basic statistics are not available within that particular region. And there are some very good reasons why that exists. We're talking about sort of small populations with a lot of different languages across, I think it's something like 25% of the Earth's surface. So, there's very clear reasons why these things exist. And I think one of the observations I had from that report was applying a standard mechanism which gets applied, say, within the Sustainable Development Goals on how to address these issues likely wouldn't work within that region for a whole range of unique characteristics of that region. So what the impact of that is that in order to be able to understand sort of prioritization needs, where risks are emerging, and what could be done about it. And the data gaps really are a hindrance to be able to have a sort of informed conversation around that. So, the main impact is that without sort of being able to understand the ground truth within the region, where we sort of don't really have the right information to say, if we're talking about ODA, this particular area, has this particular development area that affects conflict risks in this particular way, and so an efficient and effective allocation of resources of ODA would be to address here, and being able to sort of cross prioritize. So how do you make decisions saying, well, there are all these different areas and challenges, which ones are we going to prioritize? Without a sort of base level of data, it's very difficult to have those conversations.
Just to add, on the sort of conflict event data level sort of collection issue, the two sort of conventional sources being UCDP and ACLED, they are dependent on generally media reporting. And so if events in, say, PNG Highlands or in Solomons are not reported extensively in international media, or not sort of the focus of these very large, these organizations whose focus is generally in sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, the events are simply not captured. There's also, it should be noted that there is a lot of data that's potentially available or being collected. We've recently been working with the ANU Department of Pacific Affairs, and they have researchers that have entire election studies going back a decade or so, but they're on paper into the survey, so that there's a huge amount of information potentially available from some great researchers in Australia and in the Pacific, but it's not really collected in a single area or available publicly in a central repository for organizations like us, unless you happen to come upon it by happenstance, basically.
Yeah, and that was one of the key findings of the report, was while there wasn't publicly available metrics that you can use for these purposes, that was not to say that data didn't exist. There are a lot of NGOs collecting data on issues that are very pertinent to the region. So some sort of coordination aspect was going to be part of the solution to that particular report.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Smith has some questions, I believe.
Thank you very much for your evidence. To many people, the importance and emphasis on localisation would be self-evident. But what are some of the factors that work against better appreciation of localisation and against the implementation of localisation?
I mean, from my position as Director of Research, I don't necessarily have a good response to that particular question. What I do know is that some of the work that we've done with the World Bank kind of looks at this, but from the flip side, how not localizing projects causes the issues around acceptance, adoption, and ultimately sustainability and maintenance of a project and long-term ownership. So, yeah, I don't have experience the other way, answering that flip question.
If I could put a proposition to you, is the reluctance or the caution about pursuing more localized approaches and solutions a caution that comes from the donor participant about the level of assurance or risk that it has to accept the further local you might become?
I'm sure that plays a factor. Now, we're actually working with UNDP at the moment on, pretty much this problem of how do you measure risk within certain contexts that where data isn't available, and so therefore the traditional way of assessing risks is flying blind. To be frank, and so that certainly is a factor, and I think the way that it could be overcome, which is the purpose of this project with UNDP, is providing better evidence on the actual risks. So the IFC just recently produced the Global Emerging Markets database, GEMS database, which shows that with the proper governance and proper sort of guardrails in place, the risks in certain parts of the world are much, much less, orders of magnitude less for these types of investments than you would believe from your standard, credit rating agencies. So I think it's an information gap, certainly, and potentially as more information becomes available, that can be addressed and bridged.
Okay. Okay, I accept that. How do you, because there's two elements to it, an accurate understanding of the risk profile, then the actual risk appetite of the donor participant. So what observations do you have about influencing or changing risk appetites amongst donors and participants? And then is there something in your understanding of the Pacific dimension around risk and risk appetites that you can share with us?
I don't think I have a satisfying answer to that. It's not been my experience to work through the high-level donor decision-making processes for these types of things. So I think I would be, I would be making something up if I were to answer that sort of directly.
Does it follow that because we're working in a more challenging, complex environment, that part of participation is the requirement to accept more risk and to have a better appetite for risk? Do the two follow?
I mean, again, it depends on the level of risk. So, if in a perfect world, if we could properly assess the risks through, having, whatever data we were available, then yes, I think that would probably be the answer. The world that we live in is we don't have that data, and so the risk appetite isn't actually being calibrated to the actual level of risk, which I think is the area that we're sort of looking at.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Zapier.
Thank you, Tim. My question goes to the Pacific area, and it's in two parts. The first part is, what do you see as the biggest conflict risks in the Pacific in the foreseeable future? And secondly, given China's interest in the Pacific and their investments that I've noted over recent years, do you know whether they apply a peace and conflict prevention strategy when they make investments in the Pacific area?
Okay. So in terms of conflict risks within the area, I mean, I think, it's reasonably well documented on, the major ones. So obviously climate risks is a major factor, and shifting geopolitics is clearly a factor as well. I mean, I don't feel I'm, in a position to comment on how China does or doesn't apply a peace and conflict lens to these things. But I think the interesting thing about the Pacific and why our submission, really sort of highlights the data gaps and the risks associated with those data gaps is, being able to understand and prioritize and preempt those conflict risks are really important to be able to effectively deploy resources for conflict prevention. So the types of factors that the literature highlight, about conflict risk and what increases conflict risks are probably all, prevalent in the region. But unless we know where they are and why they are happening, it's difficult to apply, a prioritization to minimise conflict risk. I mean, Sasha, do you have?
Yeah, in terms of the geopolitical angle, I'd say that the risk becomes that if support, whether that's via official ODA or other mechanisms, turns into sort of this influence competition, and the sort of nature of that creates domestic competition for power, which sort of exceeds standard traditional levels as it generally applies, then that becomes a case where you could see, rival actors using political violence to sort of achieve power to then be able to serve the interests of any supporting actor. And in terms of in the Pacific in general, I think where there are sort of conflicts or violent risks at different levels. So whether if you're looking at generally interstate conflict, I think the risk is still relatively low, thankfully. There are obviously potential risks that could come from that, and mostly Australia is most likely to be effective in trying to deal with conflicts at the lower civil level, at the intercommunal level, in our immediate neighbourhood, where the impact is likely to be largest. And there, I think there's potential for greater investment in peace building, whether that's in PNG or Solomon Islands or elsewhere in Melanesia, continuing the work that's already being done through Melanesian Spear Group and other areas that Australia already supports. But I think it's sort of a matter of where the most good can be done. And I would say that we have a particular role to play as a good middle power, and we can continue that, but there can always be more.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. It might be enough time for a quick question from Ms. Jarrett, who I believe is online.
Yeah, hello everybody. My apologies for being a bit late, and I do apologise up front if you've already answered this question. But there are a couple of specific things in your comments in your submission. One was how, the importance of allied donor coordination. And my question is really, where would that, are there some priority areas where or locations or geographic areas where we should be prioritising? And do you have examples of where this has worked really, really well?
That particular observation was made in the sense of the recent withdrawal from ODA globally and, in the Pacific region has obviously been, quite substantial. And the assumption was that that substantial reduction was probably more than Australia certainly would be able to fill alone. So a conversation around coordination, we thought was a sort of valid way of getting the most value out of whatever resources are available within development assistance. Now, in terms of where that's worked well, if we have a look at the region itself, you have the Pacific Island Forum, which has had successes over the years. But I think what we're seeing is, it really is a different world than it was 2 years ago. So having a think about, what is available, what are the priorities, and how to pool resources in this particular time is a worthwhile conversation.
Great, thank
and
you.
Just to add briefly, the academic literature and the sort of systematic reviews of the effects of various peace building tools or conflict prevention tools shows that the sort of contextual and design factors that go into how the tool is used are more important than knowing whether it works or not in a specific circumstance, and coordination of multiple actors and commitment from multiple actors towards the use of a tool is found to be one of the most successful contextual and design factors behind the success in preventing conflict.
Okay, thank you. And have I got time for one more quick one?
I think we're at time, Ms. Jarrett.
No worries.
Thank you. Thank you, witnesses, for your time today. We're at time for this session. You'll be sent a proof transcript of your evidence, and you'll be able to request corrections to transcription errors. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions taken on notice, please forward your response to the Secretariat within 2 weeks of receiving the proof transcript. If members of the committee have further questions that they did not get a chance to ask, please provide these to the Secretariat by the end of this week for forwarding to witnesses. Thank you for your attendance today.
Thank you very much.
I now welcome representatives from the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and UN Women to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? Maybe ARC Centre of Excellence could begin.
Thanks very much. Professor Jackie True, Director, ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, CVOR. And my colleague.
I'm Dr. Farkhunda Akbari, a research fellow at CVOR.
Thank you. UN Women?
Hello, I'm Christine Arab. I'm the UN Women Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific. I'm Ruben Lewis, Information Program Specialist in Governance, Peace and Security at the UN Women Region.
Sorry, I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing that. Is that coming through for other people? Or?
No. Yes, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Now it's better. Thank you.
Sorry. My name is Gaëlle Demolis. I work as Governance, Peace and Security Policy and Program Specialist with UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you.
And Georgia Westaway, Specialist with Governance, Peace and Security, UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific.
Thank you. Although the subcommittee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, and the giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Witnesses giving evidence from overseas should be aware that whilst they are entitled to the protections of parliamentary privilege in Australia with respect to the evidence that they give, these protections may not be extended to another country. I now invite a representative of each organisation to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions. To assist with the transcription of the public hearing, it would be appreciated if you could please state your name before making your opening statement and responding to each question. Maybe we will again start with the ARC Centre of Excellence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Jackie True. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today on behalf of the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, CVOR, which brings together more than 200 researchers. As I said, I'm Jackie True, Director of the Centre and Professor of International Relations at Monash University. I'd like to highlight 3 points. First, gender inequality is a conflict driver that primes societies for instability and violence. And efforts to address gender inequality through Australia's International Development Programme are vital to prevent conflict. Our research finds that individuals who support violence against women are 3 times more likely to support and be recruited to violent extremism. That's a stronger predictor than religiosity, age, education, or employment status. And as the UN has noted and our research confirms, there's one common factor behind all violent extremism, including in the Indo-Pacific region, the misogyny of perpetrators. So terrorist and non-state armed groups understand gender relations better than we do. They know that by controlling gender relations and specifically women's reproduction, they can govern whole populations and territories from below as well as from above. Gender inequality underpins violent extremist, ethno-nationalist and nationalist narratives that aim to preserve leadership and public roles for men and to ensure women's subordination. And these patterns of gender inequality in societies and dramatic changes in those patterns, such as rising bride prices, girls not attending school, changes in dress, new restrictions on basic fundamental freedoms, obstruction of civic activities in public space are all lead indicators of the propensity for extremism and conflict. So second, our research in CVOR finds that conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence fuels cycles of violence and armed conflict. So we've identified conflict-related sexual violence as an early warning indicator of conflict in Myanmar, specifically in Rakhine State in 2017, and ongoing in Afghanistan and in Papua New Guinea, particularly in the highlands. Conflict-related sexual violence is strongly associated with displacement, and it's on the rise, doubling year on year since 2024 as the UN Secretary-General's May 29 report released publicly documents in part, although only the tip of the iceberg of this violence. So this type of violence, sexual and gender-based violence, in the context of conflict, constrains recovery from conflict and therefore makes conflict more likely to recur, especially with long-term displacement, inequality and children born of rape. Australia's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security makes reducing sexual and gender-based violence the second of four main goals, but the goal needs to be operationalised. We recommend that Australia's development program adopt conflict-related sexual violence and gender inequality indicators in its conflict assessment and early warning frameworks, and report against outcome 2 of the Women, Peace and Security NAP. Third, CVOR's recently launched Global Women's Safety Index measures the conditions for women's safety over 3 decades since 1995. The index evidence is consistent. Nations with greater gender equity, stronger protective institutions and better access to resources recover faster from crises, including conflict. They resist extremism more effectively and improve their development trajectories compared with those with high levels of gender inequity, weak institutional protection and poor access to resources. Australia has a strategic opportunity. Gender equality is already central to our aid program, but the Indo-Pacific region faces compounding traditional and non-traditional security risks. By targeting development assistance at gender inequality, we build local capacity of all genders, women, men, boys and girls, to prevent conflict where it first emerges. Gender equality is the most powerful counter-narrative we have against all forms of violence and our best investment in regional stability and peace. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to UN Women to make a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Foreign Affairs and Aid Subcommittee for this opportunity. My name is Christine Arab. I'm the Regional Director for UN Women Asia and the Pacific. At a time when polarization, restrictions on women's rights, and increasing conflict, climate insecurity, and displacement, the case for prevention cannot be clearer. Development assistance towards conflict prevention is among the most cost-effective investment available to governments seeking to ensure peace and stability. Within the UN and beyond, Australia has maintained this principal position towards conflict prevention for many years. And within this, a key strategic investment that Australia has made for peace is in ensuring gender equality, women's leadership, participation, and influence. Such investments are made not only as a matter of human rights, but because women are often among the first to identify the risks, to feel the impact of increased extremism, to sustain community trust even in difficult times, to mediate tensions before they bubble over, and to hold societies together before, during, and after conflicts. Women have seen firsthand how Australia's investment in women, peace and security, or what we refer to as the WPS agenda, has made a critical contribution to peace and stability across the Indo-Pacific. Under the UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security, 2 of which were adopted during Australia's term on the Council, the WPS agenda has proven itself as an effective entry point with both government and NGOs in the Indo-Pacific region. This is particularly true in the Pacific countries who have strongly engaged on the WPS agenda, such as PNG and the Solomon Islands, and the rest of the region, such as Nepal, Philippines, and Timor-Leste, who have temporary special measures and strong investments on WPS, which have resulted in some of the highest levels of women in politics and highest levels of women in uniformed services. These factors directly contribute to continued stability in these communities. Through partnership and support from Australia, UN Women is supporting national governments and regional bodies such as the PIFs and ASEAN to adopt and implement national action plan and regional frameworks on WPS. We're empowering women human rights defenders and young male allies to identify risks early, sustain dialogue and respond to emerging threats such as climate-related insecurities, cyber-enabled harms, and tech-facilitated gender-based violence. Crucially, we're supporting the next generation of women leaders and peace builders with their male allies, equipping them to drive the decisions that will define peace and security across the Indo-Pacific. And this work is grounded in intersectionality, which is consistent with Australia's own position on gender equality, disability, and social inclusion. Australia is a significant and highly valued development partner for the member states and for UN Women in the region because of this comprehensive and principled approach to GEDC, ensuring that it's in all of the policies, including its broader development, trade, and foreign policy. As multilateral spaces evolve, as civic spaces are increasingly challenged in the name of stability, and as the gender equality agenda increasingly faces serious and coordinated and resourced attacks, the new and emerging security challenges are not separate from these realities. Increasingly, dialogues are folding in a securitized approach to stability, risking sustained investment in people-centered conflict prevention approaches. Gender equality is not a development outcome. It is part of the infrastructure of peace and stability. The evidence is clear. When women and girls can exercise their rights equally, participate safely in public life, access services and justice, influence decisions that affect their communities, then societies thrive. Conversely, where these things do not happen, we see escalating instabilities quite quickly. Conflict prevention requires long-term engagement, sustained relationships, trusted and inclusive local partnerships, and the ability to act early before risks escalate into crisis. Investments include inclusive governance and strong institutions, in multilateralism, in grassroots solutions, in women-led innovations, all with GEDC as a foundation, help identify risks early. They help strengthen trust between the citizens and governments and create pathways for peaceful dialogue and problem solving. As Australia considers the future of its international development program, UN Women encourages continued investment in conflict prevention, ensuring the GEDC lens, flexible longer-term partnerships at the local, national, and regional levels that can adapt to evolving contexts and emerging crises. These investments through Australia's development partnerships, they enable technical expertise to quickly be deployed to governments and regional bodies when and where it is most needed. They provide early action in response to warning signs of instability, provide a critical lifeline to local partners, women peace builders, and civil society working on the front lines of prevention and peace building, and they strengthen the resilience, social cohesion, and economic progress and stability of our region. And I'm going to end with a quote from the Secretary General, which he recently said that around the world, the recent shift away from inclusive politics shows once again that misogyny and authoritarianism are mutually reinforcing and are anti-ethical to stable, prosperous societies. Gender equality offers a path to sustainable peace and conflict prevention, and yet we are once again moving in the opposite direction. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the call for questions to Ms Templeman.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both very much for the work you do and sharing that with us. I want to ask about where sexual violence is a key driver of conflict, and in particular, are there particular features of it, of the people who are targeted, of the type of violence that it is, rather than just using one broad term, or is it everything that fits within that term?
I'm happy to answer that, Professor Jackie.
Thanks, Doctor. Thank you.
So conflict-related sexual violence does include a whole range of forms of violence, which is, stated in the annual reports by the Secretary-General to the UN Security Council. So it can include everything from rape to forced nudity to forced marriage, as well as, and it can occur in homes, in roads, in detention camps, in prisons, and in military compounds. So, and it can affect all groups of people. Importantly, I note again that women and girls are often a disproportionate group, but men and boys are also targeted, especially of minority ethnicity. And I think that would be the case in the 3 countries that CVOR has researched: Afghanistan, Myanmar, Papua New Guinea. In the context of Papua New Guinea, we would see, especially in the over 112 ongoing conflicts in the highlands, we would see it's very much about land disputes between different tribes. So the women and girls in particular who are disproportionately targeted there are often those, who are considered to be in the land dispute. So it's directly related to the conflict dynamics and all phases of conflict, even before armed conflict, as well as during and after armed conflict. Can I turn to my colleague?
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm Farkhunda Akbari, a research fellow at CVOR. Just to add on what Professor Jackie True mentioned, that it's very important for us to understand conflict-related sexual violence, not in its very limited definition, especially given the case of Afghanistan, because there's a lot of child marriages happening without consent since the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, and also target of woman leader, coercion, domestic violence happening, and then there is no state or justice system in place to protect them. So violence against women is, especially the sexual violence, is very melded and diluted within the violence in the families and at the home level. So it's really important for us to identify that we are not really restricted on that, especially for the case of Afghanistan. The 2025 report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence only said that 12 women were victim of conflict-related sexual violence under the Taliban rule. And in our research, we have probably interviewed a lot more than that. And also for people from the community that we hear, it is a lot larger, and you just cannot report it given the authorities in place. So it's really important that we broaden that perspective of what constitutes a conflict-related sexual violence.
Thank you. And UN Women, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to add, and of course, what Jackie and her colleague have said, the broader definition, and that, of course, everything that is UN Women is foundational to the SG's reports to the GA on these things. They do have to be verifiable, and also within a quite narrow definition of conflict-related sexual violence. In the case of the Taliban, they are the de facto authorities, and there is arguably, one could make the argument it's not a situation of conflict. I wouldn't make that argument, but certainly one could. But I wanted my colleague Gael to just explain a bit on the trends of the monitoring trends, just quickly.
Thank you. No, just to add a new trend that we've seen, and UN Women issued a statement, I think 2 days ago, on the situation in Haiti, but it's also highlighting the fact that some of the CRSV is now recorded or taped by those who are perpetrating these. and then used, sometimes released in social media or shared with family members of community members. And this is also a way to instill fear in the population. So this is also a new trend of using technology to further amplify CRSV.
And we are seeing the trend continuing in Myanmar, as our colleagues before us just said. We're seeing it quite starkly, and we do have some statistics on that from all sides of the conflict, which we don't release publicly, but are happy to share at a more bilateral level if needed.
Thank you. So when you think about programs that tackle the sexual violence, the misogyny, can you talk to us about the elements that make those programs most effective? And are there any specific examples you can give us of Australian aid or others where you're seeing very effective programs that work with a community in its own set of circumstances to tackle these issues? I suppose in one, I'm after sort of what's the key criteria and elements that you see makes it effective in terms of then supporting conflict prevention?
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to answer that, Professor Jackie True. I think the first point there is that the approach to victim survivor centred practices that are also sensitive to the conflict and political conditions. So, and in all these situations, it's not only stigma of victim survivors, but also extreme risk of retaliation. So that therefore Australian aid that has supported humanitarian agencies to deliver access to health services and psychosocial services, for example, in Myanmar, in Rakhine State, that is very vital, even if none of the reports of that violence, get through the UN system, because that might threaten the access to services. So that's really important, and we have the Murad Code, which has been developed by survivors to guide all documentation and investigation of this type of violence, but also to ensure the safety and access to services for victim survivors. I think what's really also important here for Australia, whilst this committee is approaching the international development role, I think the diplomacy and the normative role of states is very important here as well, and especially in these contexts where there is impunity for largely state-led violence targeted at civilians. Yeah, I think the success, I don't think we can speak about success here, but I would also say there are major gaps in Australian aid, especially because many of the situations of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence are not situations which we know about. Where reporting can be accessed. And those situations, for example, in the PNG Highlands is very significant in this regard. So a year ago, we hosted in Australia, with support from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the first international conference focused on the Indo-Pacific region and bringing together survivors as well as practitioners and researchers looking at this issue. And what we heard there from women and men from Papua New Guinea is that their experiences of sexual violence in the context of these tribal conflicts, the 112 that I mentioned, these, from their perspective, fit within the definition of conflict-related sexual violence, and they do not have access to services. They don't have opportunities to pursue gender equality or safer gender relations within their communities. So support to civil society organisations, and there are some incipient ones there, is really vital to addressing this issue, and also that long-term support for changing societal gendered norms and gender discrimination. Also addressing the security and the small arms and light weapons and the proliferation of those weapons, which has actually made this type of violence even more possible and more pervasive across the phases of the conflicts.
Sorry, if I can just come in. Certainly the partnerships that UN Women has had with Australia, I'd say it's twofold to address the question, and Gael will give a little more detail. The first is, if you're talking in the midst of the conflict itself, if there's not been any groundwork laid, indeed, the women's NGOs are on the front line. They're trying to address this, and unfortunately in our region, most of these conflicts are resurgent over time. What Australia's done particularly well, though, in PNG, across the Pacific, in Nepal, and Bangladesh, has been to embed within the work that equality, gender equality, women's leadership investment with us and others, so that it's foundational. The mechanisms are there so that you already have the women's networks on the ground working together, because these are different groups. And also that Australia has always been very flexible in ensuring that if we want to work within the conflict in treating with sexual violence and in responding and in monitoring, we have to work with all parties. And that doesn't mean financing, that doesn't mean supporting or endorsing, that simply means access and dialogue, which has been crucial. But some of the examples we have that have been successful, maybe Gael, if you can just quickly add to what Jackie had said.
Yes, thank you very much. As your question is also on the programming aspect of misogyny, and maybe I focus on the online aspect of misogyny. With the support of Australia, we work in Asia and the Pacific region on three aspects that are complementary. One is the capacity building aspect of women's organization. So it has to be women-led, youth-led to be effective as one of the ingredients, as you were asking also about efficiency of these. So the capacity building has to be also about increasing the knowledge of women's organization, of women journalists, of women human rights defenders, but also on the other part of the segment, working with policymakers, ensuring that there is a platform, that there is a discussion between policymakers and this women's organization. So there's the policy aspect, and then the data. We've had a lot of evidence collected over the past maybe 5 years on online misogyny in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific, and in South Asia as well, and understanding the trends and constantly discussing with women's organizations so that they are aware of the new trends, of the new issues, and how they can combat these misogyny that is apparent online. One way is also to use humor. This has been quite interesting use of combating through messages that are using humoristic messages, but also working with the university. For instance, in Bangladesh, the Women Peace Cafe has been, we work with women university students so that they can find messages that are echoing their communities. So this has been quite efficient. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, if I may, one more question before I hand back. And it's just around the term gender responsive that you've both used in your submissions. Could you clarify the context that you're using that term in and what it's, and I guess what it means from a policy perspective, how being gender responsive looks when it is in policy and then implemented?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that because, this is where UN Women gets yelled at the most by member states, of course, is this term. When you use the term gender responsive, for example, gender responsive conflict sensitivity, to give a concrete example, it means asking how a program affects different people differently and whether it could unintentionally reinforce exclusion. So it means asking who benefits, who's excluded, are women in marginalized groups safe? Are women with disabilities, youth, able to engage? And can they do that with equal safety? So conflict sensitivity asks whether A could do harm. When you use a gender responsive lens, you drill that down more quickly to say, maybe it can, for some, maybe for others, it does not. And so it gives that very specific lens. And the GEDC lens is crucial because, as you know, women and men are not just women and men. They represent a diverse range of groups. But I mean, that's a quick response. Certainly, it is a term that is among in the normative agenda the most attacked. It's the term gender responsive, as it is for two reasons. Quickly taken by a number of political parties who are against advancing the rights of LGBTIQ+, but also because the term means treating with the root causes of inequality. There's a difference. Gender sensitive means you're factoring in the inequalities. Gender responsive means you're trying to change what created the inequality in this first place.
Can I come in here? Farkhunda Akbari from Siva Monash University. There's a couple of points I would like to make on the last couple of questions. One is gender responsive, but also gender responsive is also for Australian government, given that we are here now on a hearing, that how do we understand and analyze what has been done so far. I particularly want to highlight the case of Afghanistan. $2 billion was invested in gender equality in Afghanistan by the Australian government. And since the Taliban takeover, over $300 million has been invested. And this is under a gender apartheid. I think for any kind of work for this committee to go ahead and any recommendation that us over here or the UN women sitting across us are making, we have to take into consideration the real life experience and also live cases that are happening under our eyes right now. And not really go into, it's important to go into details, but also very important that the investment and there's places that we have committed in human life, in our money, in our budget, in everything, and what that does really mean. First, our expansion of understanding what does really conflict-related sexual violence means. Our friend from the UN Women was asking, is Afghanistan still in conflict? Yes, Afghanistan is still in conflict because the military withdrawal by the Western forces does not mean an end of conflict for the women of Afghanistan. It's a gender apartheid in every term that you want to describe. There's restriction. There's 100 edicts that restrict women from every aspect of life. And what are we here talking about gender equality in a development committee that we want to talk, and then there was investment and there was UN, and UN Women is still on the ground working with the de facto authorities. But also understand that consistency in every program that we do, whether it's CRSV, whether it's about gender equality, or whether the end goal is about development. Consistency is really, really important. Afghanistan, again, it is a really clear example that there was a 20-year investment and we ended up in gender apartheid. I know none of us like to talk about our failure, but I think it's really, really important to reflect on that, even though it's a very far away country or whatever, but for us to understand the Pacific, to understand PNG, to understand Myanmar, to understand Australia is really involved and need to reflect on its policies. That over 2 billion of investment and over 400 million later on, what did it really ended up to? Otherwise, what we are discussing might be meaningless, because if you're going to go back and the question that I'm getting, if Afghanistan is still in conflict or not. So I think, expansion of our understanding of sexual violence under authoritarian regime, our understanding of long-term investment to ensure equality for women's rights is not limited to a particular intervention, because we talk about development here, so it should not be tied to military intervention or political regime and so on. And thirdly, it's about gender responsive. Is Australia really gender is responsive towards its policies on Afghanistan? Development, it's money that the Australian governments and DFAT's money that goes to the UN and they're investing in Afghanistan under a gender apartheid. Is that really gender responsive? My finding, my research from the last 5 years, unfortunately, does not show that. So we have to be a lot more critical and be much more specific to reality, which is how things have unfolded. We can turn a blind eye towards Afghanistan or now Iran that is emerging, and then Myanmar. But I think these very hard cases speak truth about how our policies work, the investment, whether they're working or not, and whether we have to really be frank in our conversation about our approach the way forward. Thank you.
If I can just add, I just want to clarify, I wasn't questioning whether or not Afghanistan is in conflict. To clarify that point, I was explaining why the numbers are so low in the report that is reported by the Secretary General. The UN, set by the member states, of course, recognize the de jure authorities, not the de facto authorities. And just to flag, the largest footprint in the world that UN Women has, it is Afghanistan, and that has never changed.
Look, thank you for giving us that detail and really some ways of thinking about it. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Jarrett.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to pick up on a couple of comments that were made, specifically the consistency and the importance of long-term investment, because I think what we're talking about in this space is it's really long-term cultural change, and that takes generations, right? So I just make the comment that I couldn't agree with you more that, you know, we need to be looking at this through a long-term lens. I mean, feel free to take this on notice, but is there, are there just say one or two great examples that you can share with us, anecdotes that really show what you're talking about in terms of the consistency, the long term, and getting to a gender responsive outcome for pick one area, but yeah, if you could either share just a quick one now or take
Can I? Yeah, absolutely. Farhonda Akbari from CIVO. That's a really good question. Thank you for picking that one up. I think consistency is looking at the 20 years of investment in Afghanistan as an example. And today we had the Taliban regime twice in power. One was in 1995 to 2001, and one was from 2021, and now, unfortunately, we're going to mark the 5th anniversary in 2026, August 2026. But the way in which we see response have differed. I mean, both 5 years then and now, but because of the investment that was made on gender equality and the figures that I stated about investment and so on, created a network of Afghan women leaders, educating girls from different parts of the country, the villages, especially where Australia was based in Uruzgan province, that I'm originally from, and it's and the awareness that it created. So today, right now, in the last 5 years, the intervention, the war ended in 2021, August, for our international partners, but it continued, and then it was the Afghan women who stood up because they were educated, because there was opportunity, because they became aware of their rights, and now there is like Australia is one of the country who is one of the 4 countries who is going to take the Taliban to International Court of Justice. And then there's the Afghan women advocacy and the network internationally that is holding the Taliban accountable and changing the racial apartheid treaty to include gender apartheid as part of it. I think the hope that we have, I mean, is the world has forgotten, and then the humanitarians are sort of walking on a very fine line to be there and have their access in the country without having a lot of changes for women. But it is really the Afghan women on the ground and outside who have been benefited from the opportunities of the last 20 years, are the only actor on the ground and internationally to counter the Taliban, but also hold states accountable about their response to a gender apartheid regime. So that's a clear example of how it has worked, and 20 years is a good example that we could really take inspiration from.
And it is so good to have that on the record. Thank you. Absolutely. And
provide an example from UN Women, if of interest. Georgia Westaway here. I'd like to talk about Indonesia for a moment, if I might. So we had a very large regional access to justice program throughout the region here. And the point I want to highlight is, after working with community groups, meeting people where they were, working with women human rights defenders over many years. It culminated in a Ending Violence Against Women piece of legislation that specifically recognized violence against women as a standalone crime. This cannot happen overnight. This needs concerted efforts, long-standing partnerships. You have to work with the community around the culture, meet people where they're at, and slowly bring people along. If we go from 0 to 100 to meet the international obligations under CEDAW, we're going to go at a neck-breaking pace and give people whiplash and potentially see a greater backlash against women's rights. So when we work consistently, when we demonstrate that we are reliable partners, that we are there again and again, when we can stand alongside women human rights defenders and civil societies and community groups doing this work, which is sometimes why you won't see UN Women. We want to stand with our partners and give them the platform. When we can get this grassroots movement and support these efforts, we end up with excellent pieces of legislation, like this piece of legislation we've seen in Indonesia. Now, implementation is a different conversation, and we can have that conversation if you're interested. The other piece I'd like to highlight around Indonesia is disability inclusion. So in the past, forgive my thinking, but I think it's 2 years, we saw before Indonesia's constitutional court a case about people with intellectual and psychosocial disability. There was some very questionable legislation about whether this group of people with disabilities was able to have any kind of independence. The fact that the Constitutional Court of Indonesia has decided to take this up is due to many years of advocacy from disability groups and women's rights groups coming together to say, let's bring vulnerable, marginalized voices together, because when we bring them together, we are loud and powerful, and we are the majority, and we can do things like get the attention of the Constitutional Court of Indonesia. So that's just 2 examples from Indonesia I'd like to highlight. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And likewise, I think it's good to have those examples on the record. You both, oh, yes?
Madonna, perhaps I can just add one more, and it is an Australian direct funded initiative here, and also sticking with Indonesia and following UN Women here. Australia's support for the Women's Preventing Violent Extremism Network in Indonesia was, I think, just an excellent example of success. So what Australia did there by supporting some of these women local leaders across the country is they built a network that could advocate vis-a-vis the government for a gender-responsive Preventing Violent Extremism National Action Plan and connect the women, peace and security agenda with the Preventing Violent Extremism agenda. And actually, I know I have also myself worked on research with UN Women in this space and can say that Indonesia, really was able to identify the need to actually involve women in prevention at the local level and to empower women in their communities to be much more aware of violent extremism, the warning signs for it, and to be able to participate in community responses to that extremism. But it really was Australia before UN Women, before the UN talked about this, was actually, partly through the embassy, funding this very low-key network, but across the country, which actually, has been sustained in the country and has led to some really important outcomes, preventing extremism at its root.
And that's a great segue, actually, to my next question, which was about empowering women leadership within communities and that being at the heart of change and conflict prevention. And I was thinking, specifically, we've heard evidence from others talking about when we talk about women in leadership, we're not talking about women as government leaders. We're talking everything from the micro to the family to the community to, I think the other end of the spectrum probably is as government leaders. But where do we need to do more, or how do we make our international development programs work better to get to that outcome that we're looking for if we agree that it's putting women at that community, family, whatever level to get the gender responsive outcome?
I think that we'll take that just quickly come in. One thing, I mean, you are doing the right things as Australia. You are investing within a broad range of development and humanitarian interventions, which may not be specifically gender, but you do always prioritize that. And we see that in all of our country offices, especially those in the protracted conflicts like Afghanistan and humanitarian situation, Bangladesh conflict in Myanmar and PNG. What we see right now, and in the research we're doing, is it's as much about keeping women in public life as it is getting them in, if that makes sense. And we see countless numbers of young women in local elected and in federal elected who don't want to run anymore because of the targeting online, the cyber insecurity. It's enormous. So you see a lot of self-censoring. We see, I think, something across Asia and Pacific, over 80% of all women MPs, for example, across Asia and the Pacific, have had serious levels of online violence. But what we're seeing that Australia could do more, and especially if you focus in on the Mekong region, where trade is crucial, within ASEAN, where trade is such a crucial engagement for Australians, where Australia is such a key driver. We see trade as one of the most key ways right now in the ASEAN to really advance the ideas of inclusive governance. So you have way far too low levels of women CEOs, women on board, executive boards, women on as chief financial officers. Thailand oddly exceeds the global average by quite a bit, but by and large, it continues to be a persistent issue. Where Australia could come in quite strongly is within its trade policies, anchoring initiatives that do fold in gender responsive procurement. For example, in the Australia-Mekong partnership, we have a large gender responsive procurement program with private sector across the Mekong region. It's all anchored to family-friendly policies. It's all anchored to the enabling environment. So it's not just about getting women in the companies, but keeping them there and then making sure there's incentives. And the more that the trade dialogue that Australia is leading can anchor against that, it would be a big game changer for this glass ceiling across the Mekong region in particular.
Thank you. Can I add a couple of things on this? I'm Farhunda Akbari from Siva Monash University about how to empower more women's leadership. I mean, we are here with, we heard from UN Women, which is a prestigious organization and has its own standing, but coming from a local women's movement myself, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight. First is that Australian government has to really go beyond the bigger organizations such as UN Women and others. And not that they're not important, they're very important, but at the same time, there are a lot of barriers for grassroots women leaders to access prestigious organizations, international organizations such as UN Women or the rest. I've been involved in Afghanistan for the last 15 years. I've traveled, I have spoken to women leaders, and the first barrier is language. There are many grassroots women that they want to benefit from progress, but because they're not part of the list that these organizations have, and they could never meet that. Because in those countries, in really live cases, there's a lot of barriers in terms of the network, the privileges, and the language, and who you are, your ethnicity, everything plays a role on how you access programs and benefits and support from international organizations. So my recommendation is, and I'm also somebody from the Afghan diaspora that lived in Australia for the last 25 years, and with my research and travel in Afghanistan, that number one would be to expand your network of actors on the ground. The formal ones are really important, but at the same time, we have to really look at beyond our formal network and out of our comfort zone and try to make our programs more accessible, being from people from different language barriers, minority groups, religious, and so on. That's the key, because every time I put the word UN, for example, or another big organization in Afghanistan, the women, the grassroots leaders who are not evacuated, who are not part of anybody's list, they're like, we don't get it because I'm a poor woman from this village, from this province. I can never access those things. So there are gatekeepers, not for bad reasons, but because of those barriers, language, other things. So I think that's really, really important that we go beyond. And for Australian government and for DFAT to go with that, I mean, it's not, Afghanistan is just one example, but other countries is talk to diaspora communities, talk to experts from the countries, talk to different actors rather than ones that you know, to sort of expand your understanding of who are the vulnerable actors in the ground for you to support and to reach out beyond who is your comfort zone, which is the big organization with that meets, and also access to funding. There was some programs by the Australian government, and the women grassroots leaders were not able to access it because they don't meet that threshold. And we have to revisit those thresholds if we want to be meaningful and not just tick the box.
Sorry, can I just jump in here for a second? I know from my personal experience, I spent a lot more time hearing from Afghan diaspora members. We have events regularly in Parliament House and very significant delegations from the Afghan diaspora in Melbourne, led by women. So from my personal perspective, we spent less time dealing with UN than diaspora members. So I just want to give UN Women an opportunity to respond to the comments you've just made now.
Thanks. So I'll just touch briefly on leadership. And I think what we have here is not a one or the other situation. What we hear is one and the other. So we work with local partners and we work with government officials and the multilateral system. So we're trying to bring all of these partners together. Do these partners always agree? They do not. But that is the role of the UN Women, to convene and to bring these different voices together and to see how we can move the agenda forward for women's rights. But I want to just pause and go back to the purpose of this inquiry and really say that gender equality is the infrastructure of peace. The silent erosion of women's rights, the silent closing of civic space, when women at the local markets can no longer have stalls, when women can no longer speak at local town halls, these are your early warning signs that instability is knocking at the door. So women's rights and women's civil society are an increasingly and vital partner for all of us. For UN Women, they are our constituents. We are answerable to them. We are born out of the women's rights movement and we have not moved away from them. But our role now is to bring people together to push this agenda forward that in a way that is not going to have a backlash against them. And we've seen that in a couple of countries globally. I know this is a global inquiry. So I just want to say that gender equality, you know, if we're thinking about conflict, what we see when we respond is often we wait for border clashes, the tanks to roll out, the jets to be scrambled. What we're saying is it starts decades before. It starts with the silent erosion of the rebar of communities. And that often comes up in women's rights and gender equality. Why? Because it's easy to target a marginalized group. It's hard to target a powerful force. So once you have a marginalized, vulnerable group targeted, such as a specific, social identity group of women, then you know instability is coming. And when you have impunity for violation against these minorities, that's when the instability grows. It festers, and grievances learn that they can get away with violations without justice. I'm going to pass to my colleague here, who's also going to compliment.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to make two additional points. Sorry, Gail, UN Women, Gail Demolis, UN Women. One key point, I think, is the support to national action plans. So through the past few years, we also were supported UN Women by DFAT on this. And in the past, I think, 3 years, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia have adopted a national action plan on women's insecurity. And it's been a very, very important tool to ensure that women's leadership is not just on paper, but there are actually policies and discussions around increasing women, whether it's in the security sector, but more importantly also support to women leadership at the community level. So if we think about Thailand, who just adopted the National Action Plan, there's also 11 women's empowerment centers scattered around the country. And each center would discuss different issues. One would be focusing on women's disability rights. One would be discussing more climate security issues. Another one would be discussing cybersecurity issues. But they come together and they use livelihood and women's economic empowerment as one of the drivers to make sure that they come together, but discuss these very sensitive issues. And this is also a way for them to engage with the government. So this approach, that is a policy approach, but also a community-based approach, has been very effective, and we need to see more of this. And I think another point I wanted to make is on the flexibility, because you were asking also what can be done more. And one thing that we really appreciated was the flexibility of this, because we've been able to discuss also with the FAT regularly and reprioritize. If there's a conflict, if there's a crisis, we can reorient, we can adjust funding also to these organizations. And for instance, in the case of Nepal or Bangladesh, we were able to support women's organization, grassroots organization, women leaders, coming to a global regional platform and making sure that their voices are heard. So it's been also an emphasis on young women, on women with disability, and ensuring that this platform can also be effective. Thank you.
If I might just...
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Madonna. No, I wanted to respond to your previous question, but go ahead.
I was just going to ask, and please feel free to jump in on that one, but you've both brought up, both groups have brought up the online violence or the impact of, obviously social media, and we're seeing a reduction in women's rights, women's leadership, their roles in community as indicators that we should be watching. How prevalent of a problem it is online social media violence to really seeing that contributing to that backsliding on gender equality that I believe you're really referring to, and how do we address this? We're trying here in Australia, but we're one small group. Yeah.
Thank you. A lot of statistics, and some of which we've arrived at in partnership with Australia, including the E-Safety Commission office, because we work quite closely with them. One thing I would flag, what we're seeing at a broader level, is the militarization and instrumental. The governments are using social media as a way of misinformation as parts of conflict, and we're seeing this across the board. It's not a coincidence that in Iran they went, 88 days without internet. And yet what you were seeing released actually was using a lot of feminized visions of women as a pro-Iranian or anti-United States sentiment. And that's something that all parties of conflicts are starting to do. We also see in a number of countries across Asia, they will block internet very quickly when there's an uprising. When this happened in Afghanistan, it was one of the most difficult 72 hours. This fundamentally made us question what we could continue to do. This is the hardest context that we work in the world, is Afghanistan. But it held true for Myanmar when it gets blocked as well. So we can certainly share with you a series of statistics, which we can give offline, but I would just want to flag that we're seeing that more and more happening. We've also been assessing in ASEAN, for example, the degree to which women-led or women-focused civil society are facing more cyber violence and cyber interference, and it's significantly higher than those NGOs that are not treating with gender issues or are not women-led. So we are seeing this consistently, including with women human rights defenders, online violence consistently more than what we see with other human rights defenders. And that is a global statistic. But I stop there and hand over to Jackie and team.
No, thanks, Christina. Definitely echo those points. One thing, Madonna, I wanted to come back to is I think what is a really significant pattern for us to take seriously, especially when we're thinking about prevention of conflict and the role of the International Development Programme, is that in many of the most repressive situations, especially in our region, the Indo-Pacific region, we actually see women fighting back. Okay, so whereas in Australia, the discourse is around, the online misogyny and hate directed often at women, especially women leaders, women's human rights defenders, and so on, that this is, kind of leading them to sort of, putting them off public life, right, and being public leaders. But actually what you could say in some of these situations like Myanmar, like Afghanistan, the most egregious situations for women's rights is that women are actually fighting back, right? They are actually forming movements, they are resisting, and often they're some of the only ones resisting. And what I would say to you, and what I would like to see Australia do, is actually start finding ways to support these incipient women-led pro-democracy, pro-human rights, pro-peace movements. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to do that. Farouk has mentioned previously the Australian diaspora and some of the many connections they provide to local partners in these countries. But we have to find ways over the long term to support these pro-democracy, pro-human rights activists, especially women leaders in these countries. Otherwise, we are going to lose a generation, and we're going to lose the opportunity to turn the trajectory in these countries which are conflict prone, which are in conflict, and which is involving, mass atrocities in these areas. So I think that's very, very significant. And just to turn to one piece of research evidence, my colleague in UN Women mentioned the Mekong region. And here we have been researching alongside, under our ARC Australian Research Council funded centre, together with our partner, the Asia Foundation. And we've been looking at both Cambodia and Laos, and looking at researching how women and men, in a gender-responsive way, experience a range of insecurities, including insecurities related to border conflict, but also to climate change, also to cyber scams, trafficking, a range of insecurities. And specifically what we have found there is that whilst women have as much knowledge as men about these insecurities, and even some of the solutions to them at the root, at the local level where they should be addressed and they can be addressed, is that they don't have the confidence to do that. And the institutional structures, even the local community structures, local government structures, even in a place like Laos, which has the Laos Women's Union and definitely was alongside us when we were doing all the research, there is not their ability to be part of governance committees, mediation committees, to be able to actually shape those responses to insecurity. So actually also there we also see that confidence gap is really significant, and that is where Australia's aid program can help. So actually, supporting local women's leadership programs, I think is really vital. Young women, disabled women, all of the points that UN Women has been making there. We're continuing to research alongside some of the women, peace and security programming that's being delivered at the local community level within Cambodia and Laos, and it is funded by the New Zealand Foreign Affairs program to the Asia Foundation, and our funding is coming from Australian government, so it's a partnership there. But I think reflecting on that 20-year intervention in Afghanistan that has resulted in essentially failure on multiple levels, but especially failure when we look at the situation for women and girls in that country, we seriously have to think about how we start local and build from there. And that whilst we all love laws and quotas and things like this, they're not the first step, and they're not sustainable always, and that's the reality.
Thank you. Up to you, Chair.
Thank you. We've gone slightly over time. I know that Mr. Newman had indicated he had a question some time ago. Are you still online, Shane?
It's to UN Women. If they can take this on notice, and if the Secretary can give this to them, the inquiry in terms of reference talks about the role of Australia's international development program in preventing conflict. On section 5, which talks about the impact of international development on early identification and mitigation of conflict, you would have heard the chair talking about whether we should, in our international development, talk about whether our aid is explicit or implicit when it comes to conflict prevention. And UN Women, you make it clear in that paragraph that it should be implicit. And then in the next sentence you say, but however, in climate vulnerable contexts, this contribution is strongest when development investments are explicitly conflict sensitive and gender responsive, because climate stress tends to amplify existing inequalities rather than create them. I don't understand why you say that. And secondly, surely workplace matters, media power, educational opportunities and health issues also amplify inequalities in society. If you can take that on notice and get back to us, we need some clear guidance as to whether our foreign aid and our international development needs to be implicit or explicit, and if so, on what basis? Because otherwise we'll come across as white paternalism and a first world sort of aggression towards people. So we need to be very clear about what we do and how we frame our international development. If UN Women can take that on notice and get back to us.
Thank you, and we'll ensure that the text of that question is provided to you to help you to answer that on notice. So we're out of time for this session today. Thank you for your time to appear before the committee today. You'll be sent a proof transcript of your evidence and you'll be able to request any corrections to transcription errors. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions taken on notice, please forward your response to the Secretariat within 2 weeks of receiving the proof transcript. If members of the committee have further questions they did not get a chance to ask, please provide these to the Secretariat by the end of this week for forwarding to the witnesses. I would like to thank all committee members as well as witnesses for their time here today, and I now declare today's public hearing closed. Thank you.